Darkness swallowed the road ahead, stretching endlessly into the void. My headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the night, but beyond that, the world seemed to dissolve into an abyss. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like hours, and the gas gauge was dipping lower than I liked. The GPS signal had vanished miles ago, leaving me with nothing but the vague directions I had scribbled on a crumpled napkin. A wrong turn had led me off the main highway and onto this desolate road that wound through thick, towering trees, their branches forming a skeletal canopy above. The deeper I drove, the more the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees leaning inward as if whispering secrets to one another. The radio, which had been playing faint static for the past hour, suddenly cut out entirely. The silence that followed was thick and unnatural, pressing against my ears with an almost physical weight. I adjusted in my seat, my fingers gripping the wheel a little tighter. Something about this stretch of road unsettled me. Maybe it was the absence of streetlights, or the way the fog curled along the edges of the asphalt, moving like living tendrils. I checked my phone again. No service. Of course. A shadow flickered at the edge of my vision. My breath caught in my throat as I instinctively glanced toward the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something staring back at me. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind, stretching into the distance like a black ribbon unraveling into the unknown. I exhaled, shaking my head at myself. It was just the trees. My mind was playing tricks on me. The road dipped suddenly, the car jerking as it hit a pothole. I cursed under my breath, slowing down as I navigated the uneven path. The forest seemed to thicken around me, the trees growing denser, the spaces between them darker, deeper. It felt like I was driving into the mouth of something vast and waiting. Then, out of nowhere, my headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. My heart slammed against my ribs as I slammed the brakes, the tires screeching against the damp asphalt. The car skidded slightly before coming to a stop, the beams illuminating a lone woman, standing motionless in the center of the road. She was barefoot, wearing a thin, white nightgown that billowed slightly in the cold night air. Her hair was long and tangled, falling in messy waves over her face, obscuring her features. She didn't move. She didn't even flinch at the sudden arrival of my car. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my breathing shallow. My instinct screamed at me to reverse, to turn around and get the hell out of there. But something held me in place. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the uneasy sense that she needed help. I reached for the horn, pressing it briefly. The sound echoed through the still night, but she didn't react. She just stood there, unmoving, unbothered. My pulse pounded in my ears. Something wasn't right. I rolled down the window slightly. "Hey, are you okay?" My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. No response. A slow, creeping dread slithered up my spine. My fingers hovered over the gear shift, ready to throw the car into reverse, but then she moved. Not in a normal way. Not like a person reacting to a voice. It was a slow, unnatural shift, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Her head tilted to the side, the tangled curtain of hair parting just enough for me to see one eye. A pale, milky white, unfocused yet staring directly at me. Cold washed over me. My brain screamed at me to go. Every instinct in my body told me to get out of there. But I was frozen, trapped in her gaze. The air inside the car felt thick, suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. Then, she took a step forward. Just one. It was enough. I slammed the gear into reverse, my foot stomping on the accelerator. The car lurched backward, the tires spinning against the slick road before catching traction. My hands trembled on the wheel as I backed away. But I didn't dare take my eyes off her. She was still staring, still standing there. And then she smiled. Not a normal smile. Not a friendly or relieved or even a sinister one. It was too wide, too stretched, as if her skin didn't quite fit right. Her lips curled back, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white, too numerous. I couldn't breathe. Something moved behind her. A shadow, darker than the night itself, slithered out from the trees. It was massive, yet shapeless, shifting and writhing like smoke-given form. It unfurled behind her, stretching long fingers across the road, creeping toward me. I hit the gas. The car shot backward, my pulse hammering as the speedometer climbed. The trees blurred past, the headlights bouncing wildly. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. And then, the car slammed into something. The impact jolted me forward, the seatbelt biting into my chest. The engine sputtered. The hood crumpled against a massive tree that hadn't been there a second ago. Dazed, gasping for breath, I looked up. The woman was standing right in front of the car, closer than before. Her head tilted again, the same sickeningly slow motion. That twisted, stretched smile still frozen on her face. The shadow loomed behind her, rising, solidifying. It had eyes now, dozens of them, gleaming, hungry, unblinking. The air around me thickened, my vision blurring at the edges. My limbs felt heavy, my body sinking into the seat, as if gravity had doubled. She lifted a hand. Her fingers were too long. The darkness swallowed everything. I awoke to the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and insistent in the silence of the night. My room was bathed in shadows, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the thin curtains. It was one of those nights when sleep seemed an elusive dream, and every creak of the house felt like a whisper in the darkness. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild, that the sense of unease creeping up my spine was nothing more than the residue of a bad dream. But the feeling persisted, a gnawing sensation that something was not right. I sat up, the bed creaking beneath me, and glanced at the clock on my nightstand. It was past midnight, the hour when the world is at its quietest, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, shivering slightly as my bare feet touched the cold wooden floor. With hesitant steps, I made my way to the window and peered out into the night. The world outside was shrouded in darkness, the familiar shapes of the garden and trees transformed into ominous silhouettes. I scanned the yard, my eyes straining to see anything out of the ordinary. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the night and the quiet rustle of the wind through the leaves. I turned away from the window, telling myself that I was being foolish, that there was nothing to fear in the shadows. As I made my way back to bed, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the faintest of whispers. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and strained to listen. The sound came again, this time louder, a soft, eerie murmur that seemed to be coming from somewhere within the house. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it the wind, or something more sinister? Summoning all my courage, I forced myself to move, to follow the sound. It led me out of my room and into the hallway, where the darkness seemed even more oppressive. I flicked on the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb must have burned out, I thought, as I made my way cautiously down the hall. The sound grew louder, a disembodied voice that sent shivers down my spine. It seemed to be coming from the basement. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, staring down into the pitch-black abyss below. The basement had always been a place of mystery and fear, a place where the shadows seemed to hold secrets, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth. Taking a deep breath, I descended the stairs, each step echoing in the silence. The closer I got, the louder the voice became, until it was a chorus of whispers, like 100 voices speaking at once. At the bottom of the stairs, I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers trembling. The light flickered on, casting an eerie glow over the cluttered space. My eyes darted around, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing there, just the old furniture and boxes that had been stored there for years. I was about to turn back when I noticed it, a small, dusty book lying on the floor, as if it had been placed there deliberately. I picked it up, my hand shaking, and brushed off the dust. The cover was plain, with no title or author, and the pages were yellowed with age. I opened it, the musty smell of old paper filling my nostrils. The writing inside was strange, a language I couldn't understand, but as I flipped through the pages, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a jolt that they were coming from the book. I dropped it, my heart racing, and backed away. The book lay there, open, the pages fluttering as if caught in an invisible breeze. I wanted to run, to escape the house and the eerie whispers, but I found myself drawn to it, compelled to understand its secrets. I picked it up again, my fingers tracing the strange symbols on the pages. As I stared at the writing, the words seemed to shift and change, forming shapes and images that danced before my eyes. Suddenly, the room grew colder, the temperature plummeting to a bone-chilling cold. I could see my breath in the air, and the shadows seemed to grow darker, more menacing. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of voices that filled my mind, drowning out my thoughts. I tried to close the book, but my hands wouldn't obey, as if they were being controlled by some unseen force. The symbols on the pages glowed with an eerie light, and I felt a strange sensation, as if the book was drawing me in, pulling me into its world. I fought against it, struggling to break free, but it was no use. The darkness closed in around me, and I felt myself falling into the book and the world of shadows it contained. I landed with a thud, the air knocked out of me. I was no longer in the basement, but in a dark, twisted version of it. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with ancient tomes that seemed to pulsate with a dark energy. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the whispers were louder than ever, a constant murmur that filled my mind. I stood, my legs trembling, and looked around. The basement was larger than it should have been, stretching out into the darkness. I could see shapes moving in the shadows, and I realized with a jolt that I was not alone. Figures emerged from the darkness, their faces hidden in the shadows, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They moved towards me, their whispers growing louder, more urgent. I backed away, my mind racing. I needed to get out, to escape this nightmare, but I had no idea how. The figures closed in, their whispers forming a single word that echoed in my mind: run. I turned and ran, my heart pounding, as the shadows closed in around me. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from the voices, from the darkness that threatened to consume me. The basement seemed to stretch on forever, a labyrinth of bookshelves and shadows. I stumbled and fell, my hands scraping against the rough floor, but I pushed myself up and kept running. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the darkness closing in around me. I was running out of time, running out of hope. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it, a faint light in the distance, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I ran towards it, my legs burning with the effort, and burst into the light. I found myself back in the basement, the familiar clutter and musty smell a welcome relief. The book lay on the floor, closed, the whispers silenced. I picked it up, my hand shaking, and stared at it. I knew I couldn't keep it, couldn't risk opening it again. I needed to get rid of it, to destroy it. I climbed the stairs, my legs trembling, and made my way to the fireplace. The fire was still burning, the flames casting a warm glow over the room. I threw the book into the fire, watching as the flames consumed it, the pages curling and blackening. As the book burned, I felt a sense of relief. A weight lifted from my shoulders. The whispers were gone, the darkness banished. I knew I would never forget the night, the terror I had experienced, but I also knew that I had faced it and survived. I climbed back into bed, exhausted but at peace, and let sleep claim me. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside my window. The sun was shining, the sky a clear blue. It was as if the night before had been a bad dream, a nightmare that had no place in the light of day. But as I stood in front of the fireplace, staring at the ashes of the book, I knew it had been real. The shadows, the whispers, the darkness, they were all real. And I knew, deep down, that they were not gone, that they were waiting, biding their time. And one day, they would return. But for now, I was safe. For now, the house was just a house, and the basement just a basement, and the night was just a night. But I knew better. I knew that the darkness was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for its chance to rise again. And when it did, I would be ready. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that night began to fade, replaced by the routines of daily life. But deep down, I knew that the darkness was never truly gone. It lingered in the corners of my mind, a shadow that refused to be banished by the light of day. I went about my life, trying to push the memories away, but there were moments when the whispers would return, faint and fleeting, like echoes of a nightmare. One evening, as I sat in my study, going through some old papers, I felt that familiar sense of unease creeping up my spine. The room grew colder, the shadows longer, and the air seemed to thicken with a presence I couldn't see, but could feel. I looked around, half expecting to see the figures from the basement emerging from the darkness. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the house and the flickering light of the fireplace. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that it was just my imagination, but the unease persisted. I decided to take a walk, hoping that the fresh air would clear my mind. As I stepped outside, the cool night air enveloped me, and I breathed in deeply, trying to calm my racing heart. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver glow over the garden, and the trees whispered in the breeze. I walked along the familiar path, the crunch of gravel beneath my feet a comforting sound. But as I neared the edge of the garden, I heard it, the faintest of whispers, carried on the wind. I stopped, straining to listen, and the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was the same eerie murmur I had heard in the basement, the same disembodied voices that had haunted my nightmares. My heart pounded in my chest, and I turned to leave, but something held me back. A strange compulsion, an urge to follow the whispers and uncover their source. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing in the silence, until I reached the old oak tree at the far end of the garden. The tree had always been a place of comfort, its gnarled branches a testament to the passage of time, but now it seemed menacing, its shadow a dark pool on the ground. I circled the tree, the whispers growing louder with each step, until I saw it a small, hidden door set into the base of the trunk. I had never noticed it before, and I wondered how it could have gone unnoticed for so long. With trembling hands, I reached for the handle and pulled. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow passage that seemed to lead into the depths of the earth. A part of me wanted to turn back, to close the door and pretend I had never seen it, but the whispers urged me forward. I stepped into the passage, the walls pressing in on me, and began to descend. The air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to swallow me whole. The whispers were all around me now, a cacophony of voices that filled my mind, drowning out my thoughts. The passage seemed to go on forever, a never-ending descent into the unknown. My legs burned with the effort, but I couldn't stop, couldn't turn back. The whispers urged me onward, deeper into the darkness. At last, I reached the bottom, and the passage opened into a vast underground chamber. The walls were lined with ancient symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and on it lay an object that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. It was a book, similar to the one I had found in the basement, but larger and more ornate. The cover was adorned with strange symbols, and the pages seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging me to open the book and discover its secrets. I approached the pedestal, my hands trembling, and reached for the book. As my fingers touched the cover, I felt a jolt of energy, and the whispers intensified, a chorus of voices that filled my mind. I opened the book, and the symbols on the pages seemed to dance before my eyes. As I stepped into the ancient mansion, a chill ran down my spine. The air was thick with the scent of decay and history, mingling together in a haunting symphony. The creaking floorboards beneath my feet echoed through the desolate halls, each step amplifying the eerie silence that surrounded me. I had come to this forsaken place seeking answers, driven by an insatiable curiosity that refused to be silenced. Stories of the mansion's dark past had intrigued me for years, tales of restless spirits and unexplainable occurrences that had plagued its inhabitants. But now, as I stood in the dimly lit foyer, I couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. Was I ready to uncover the truth? The grand staircase loomed before me, its ornate banister covered in a thick layer of dust. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. With each step, the floor groaned beneath my weight, as if protesting my presence. The walls seemed to close in on me, suffocating me with their oppressive darkness. As I reached the top of the staircase, I was greeted by a long corridor lined with closed doors. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls, creating an illusion of movement in the corner of my eye. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. that unseen eyes were tracking my every move. I approached the first door on the left, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. It turned with a reluctant creak, revealing a room shrouded in shadows. Dust motes danced in the air, illuminated by the faint light filtering through the cracked window. The room was empty, save for a dilapidated armchair and a broken mirror hanging on the wall. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. My reflection in the mirror was distorted, twisted by the fractures in the glass. It was as if the mansion itself was mocking me, distorting my perception of reality. I tore my gaze away, determined to continue my search. The next room was equally desolate, its furniture covered in white sheets that had turned yellow with age. I felt a pang of sadness as I imagined the lives that had once filled these rooms, now reduced to mere remnants of a forgotten past. But I couldn't dwell on these thoughts for long. I had a mission to fulfill. As I moved deeper into the mansion, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The air was thick with an otherworldly presence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls, a haunting reminder of my solitude. I reached a door at the end of the corridor, its surface marred by deep scratches. It was as if something had desperately tried to escape from within. My heart pounded in my chest as I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What lay beyond this door? Would I finally uncover the truth, or would I be met with something far more sinister? Summoning my courage, I turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was bathed in an eerie blue light, casting long shadows on the walls. A faint, almost imperceptible hum filled the air, resonating in my bones. I took a step forward, my breath catching in my throat. The room was empty, save for a single, ancient book resting on a pedestal in the center. Its cover was adorned with intricate designs, symbols that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. I approached the book, my curiosity piqued. What secrets did it hold? What knowledge had been hidden away for centuries? As I reached out to touch the book, a cold, unseen force pushed me back. My heart raced as I stumbled, barely managing to keep my balance. The room seemed to come alive, the shadows shifting and twisting around me. I could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent, watching me with a cold, calculating gaze. I took a step back, my mind racing. What was this place? What had I stumbled upon? The answers I sought seemed just out of reach, tantalizingly close yet impossibly distant. I had to find a way to uncover the truth, to delve deeper into the mysteries of the mansion. Driven by a newfound determination, I left the room and continued my exploration. The mansion seemed to come alive around me, its walls whispering secrets that I couldn't quite grasp. I felt a strange connection to this place, as if it was calling out to me, drawing me deeper into its dark embrace. As I moved through the labyrinthine corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and faint whispers filled the air. I tried to ignore them, focusing on my goal. I had to find the source of the mansion's power, the heart of its darkness. After what felt like hours of wandering, I finally stumbled upon a hidden door, concealed behind a tattered tapestry. My heart raced as I pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the depths of the mansion. The air grew colder as I descended, the darkness closing in around me. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a vast, underground chamber. The walls were lined with ancient runes, glowing faintly in the dim light. In the center of the chamber stood a massive stone altar, covered in strange, pulsating symbols. I could feel the power radiating from it, a palpable force that seemed to seep into my very soul. As I approached the altar, I noticed a series of ancient tomes arranged in a circle around it. Each book seemed to hum with its own unique energy, their covers adorned with symbols that matched those on the altar. I couldn't resist the urge to examine them, to uncover the knowledge they held. I picked up the first book, its pages yellowed with age. The words were written in a language I couldn't understand, but as I traced my fingers over the symbols, they seemed to come alive, dancing across the page. I felt a strange connection to the words, as if they were speaking directly to me. As I delved deeper into the tomes, I began to piece together the history of the mansion. It had once been the home of a powerful sorcerer, a man who had dabbled in dark magic and ancient rituals. He had sought to harness the power of the mansion, to unlock its secrets and achieve immortality. But something had gone terribly wrong, and the sorcerer's experiments had unleashed a malevolent force that had consumed the mansion and its inhabitants. I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as I read the sorcerer's final words, scrawled hastily in the margins of the last tome. He had warned of the darkness that now resided within the mansion, a force that would stop at nothing to claim the souls of those who ventured too close. I realized that I had become a part of this dark history, ensnared by the very forces I had sought to understand. But I couldn't turn back now. I had to find a way to confront the darkness, to break the cycle and free the mansion from its curse. I steeled myself, determined to face whatever lay ahead. As I prepared to leave the chamber, I noticed a small, hidden passageway at the back of the room. It seemed to lead deeper into the mansion, towards the very heart of its darkness. With a deep breath, I stepped into the passage, the walls closing in around me. The journey ahead would be perilous, but I was ready. I would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The mansion's secrets would not remain hidden for much longer, and as I ventured further into the darkness, I couldn't help but wonder what awaited me at the end of my journey. Would I find the answers I sought, or would I become another lost soul, consumed by the mansion's insatiable hunger? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain: I would not be deterred. I would face the darkness head-on, and I would emerge victorious. The mansion's secrets would be mine to uncover, and its dark past would be brought to light. I was ready to confront the unknown, to face the mysteries that lay hidden within the shadows. As I continued my descent into the depths of the mansion, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides. My footsteps echoed through the narrow passageway, a haunting reminder of my solitude. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I emerged into a vast, underground cavern. The walls were lined with ancient carvings, depicting scenes of ritual and sacrifice. In the center of the cavern stood a massive stone monolith, covered in strange symbols that pulsed with an eerie light. I approached the monolith, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick with a palpable sense of malevolence, and I could feel the presence of something ancient and powerful watching me. I knew that I was on the brink of uncovering the mansion's darkest secret, and I steeled. The night was heavy with silence, an eerie stillness that clung to the air like an unshakable presence. The road stretched endlessly before me, cracked asphalt glistening under the pale glow of my headlights. The world outside my car felt unreal, as though I had driven past the boundaries of civilization and into a realm untouched by time. I had been on the road for hours, my eyes burning from exhaustion, but there was nowhere to stop. No gas stations, no motels, just the same winding road cutting through an abyss of dense, whispering trees. The GPS had given up miles ago, flickering uselessly before freezing on a blank screen. My phone had no signal. I kept driving, hoping to find some sign of life, but the further I went, the more the road seemed to unravel into nothingness. Then, in the distance, I saw it, a house, standing alone against the endless stretch of darkness. Its windows were dark, its structure old and weathered, but it was something, a place to stop, to rest, to figure out where the hell I was. As I pulled into the overgrown driveway, my car sputtered violently, and the engine cut out with an unsettling finality. I turned the key, but it refused to start. Just my luck. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the thick night air, the scent of damp earth and decay filling my nostrils. The house loomed before me, its once white walls now stained with age, the wooden door slightly ajar. The sight of it sent a ripple of unease through me, but I had no choice. I knocked, my fist meeting the wood with a dull, hollow sound. Silence. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. The wind stirred the trees, their whispering rustles sounding too much like voices. A prickle ran down my spine. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the scent of something old and rotting lurking beneath it. The room was dimly lit by the moon filtering through torn curtains. Furniture sat covered in white sheets, their ghostly shapes casting eerie shadows across the warped wooden floor. I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. but the house swallowed the sound whole. As I stepped further inside, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. My flashlight flickered, the beam stuttering as if something unseen had passed in front of it. I told myself it was just the wind, just an old house settling. But my gut twisted with a feeling I couldn't ignore. Something was watching me. I moved through the house cautiously, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the suffocating silence. The walls were lined with faded portraits, their subjects staring down with hollow eyes, expressions twisted in frozen grimaces. The deeper I went, the more the air thickened, pressing against me with a weight that felt almost sentient. Then I heard it, a faint creak from upstairs. My heart pounded against my ribs as I pointed my flashlight toward the staircase. The steps were warped and splintered, leading up into a darkness that swallowed the light whole. Every part of me screamed to leave, to get back in my car and find another way, but my feet moved forward against my better judgment. Each step groaned beneath my weight, the sound impossibly loud in the silence. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched before me, doors standing ajar like waiting mouths. The air was colder here, biting through my clothes, making my breath come out in visible puffs. I took a hesitant step forward when a sound stopped me dead, a whisper, impossibly close, right at my ear. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my grip. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the whisper had been real. It had spoken my name. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep moving. The floorboards groaned beneath me as I approached the first door. Inside, the room was sparse, a bed pushed against the far wall, its mattress sunken in the middle. A single chair sat beside it, positioned as if someone had been watching over the bed for a long time. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic. I turned my flashlight toward the wall, and my stomach lurched. Words had been scratched into the peeling wallpaper, deep grooves that formed a message over and over. Don't let it see you. A cold hand of fear gripped my spine. I stepped back, the floor creaking beneath me. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing inward. I turned to leave, but the whisper came again, right against my ear. I ran. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I sprinted down the hallway, toward the staircase, but as I reached the top step, I froze. Something stood at the bottom of the stairs. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, its body a shadow against the darkness, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if studying me. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse hammering in my ears. The air grew thick, suffocating, pressing against me like unseen hands. Then it moved, a slow, jerky step forward. The floorboards beneath it didn't creak. It was silent, too silent. I stumbled back, my body screaming at me to run, but my limbs felt heavy, as if the air itself had solidified around me. The figure took another step, and then another, its face still hidden in the darkness. And then I saw them. Hands, not attached to arms, not part of a body, just hands, emerging from the darkness behind the figure. They reached out from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, grasping, stretching toward me, fingers twitching hungrily. A scream clawed at my throat, but I couldn't make a sound. The hands moved closer, writhing, grasping at the air between us. I forced myself to move, to stumble back into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. Silence. Then a single tap. A tap on the other side of the door, slow and deliberate. I held my breath. Another tap. Then another. And then the whisper came again, right against my ear. Closer this time. And it was laughing. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen, locked in place by something far beyond fear. The tapping on the door continued, slow, rhythmic, each sound sinking deeper into my mind like the ticking of some unseen clock, counting down to something terrible. My breath was shallow, barely there, and I squeezed my eyes shut as if that would somehow make it all disappear. But the whisper came again, closer, curling around my ear like cold breath. And this time, I understood the words. You let it see you. A shudder ripped through me. I wanted to deny it, to convince myself that I had imagined the thing at the bottom of the stairs, that the hands reaching from the walls were a trick of the dim light. But I knew better. I had felt it in my bones, in the way the air had thickened. and the way my own name had been whispered from lips that did not belong to anything living. And now, something wanted me to know. I had made a mistake. The tapping stopped. Silence crashed down over me like a suffocating wave. I strained to listen, to hear anything beyond the frantic beating of my own heart. But the house had gone completely still. I forced my body to move, inching backward, my hands fumbling for anything to hold onto. My fingers grazed the doorknob of a closet, a place to hide. A terrible idea, but the only one I had. I twisted the knob and slipped inside, pressing my back against the cold wood as I shut the door without a sound. The space was small, the air thick with the scent of dust and age, but at least I was hidden. At least I could breathe. Or so I thought. The silence stretched on, an unbearable tension that made my muscles ache. I forced myself to slow my breathing, to listen for any sign of movement outside the door. Minutes passed, maybe longer. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but terror held me hostage in that cramped, suffocating space. And then, the breathing started. Not mine. It was deep, ragged, just beyond the door. The sound of something inhaling too sharply, exhaling too slowly, as if savoring the air itself. I clamped my hand over my mouth, biting down on my fingers to keep from making a sound. The breathing grew louder, closer, until I could almost feel it pressing against the thin barrier of the closet door. A shadow passed through the crack of light beneath the door, stretching long and unnatural across the floor. It stopped. I didn't move, didn't blink. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. The doorknob twitched. My stomach dropped. It twisted again, slowly this time, as if whatever was outside was savoring the anticipation of finding me. The latch clicked. My heart stopped. And then silence. For a moment, nothing happened. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I barely breathed. My ears strained for any sound, any indication of movement, but there was nothing, just the unbearable quiet. Then, with a slow, deliberate creak, the door began to open. I reacted without thinking. I shoved against the door with everything I had, slamming it shut with a force that sent dust billowing through the cracks. My hand scrabbled for the lock, twisting it into place, just as something outside pressed against the wood. The whisper came again, right against the door, seeping through like a sickness. "You let it see you." I bit down on a cry, pressing myself further into the closet. My body ached with tension, every muscle locked in place. The air inside the small space had turned stale, heavy with the scent of something rotten. I dared to glance down, to the small gap beneath the door, and my stomach turned to ice. Feet, but not human feet. They were too long, too thin, the bones jutting at odd angles. The skin was stretched too tight, too pale, as if whatever stood outside the closet had never been meant to walk among the living. And it wasn't alone. More shadows joined the first, shifting and twitching unnaturally, their outlines pressing against the door like hungry insects drawn to a flame. I clenched my eyes shut, my fingers digging into the splintered wood of the closet walls. The whisper came again, but this time, it was inside the closet with me. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The breath was stolen from my lungs as something cold brushed against the back of my neck. My mind shattered, my thoughts spiraling into incoherent terror. I bolted. I didn't care where. Didn't care what waited for me outside the door. I just needed to get out. I threw the door open and ran, my feet barely touching the ground as I fled down the hallway. The walls pulsed, the shadows stretched toward me, the whispering growing into a chorus of voices that scraped against my sanity. I hit the stairs at full speed, nearly tumbling as I descended. The house groaned, the very foundation seeming to tremble as I reached the bottom. The front door loomed ahead, slightly ajar, the only thing standing between me and the outside world. I sprinted for it, but as I reached the threshold, something caught my ankle. I crashed to the floor, my chin slamming against the wood. Pain exploded through my skull, but I had no time to focus on it. Cold fingers wrapped around my leg, pulling, dragging me backward. I clawed at the floor, nails splintering against the wood as I kicked, thrashed, fought against whatever was trying to drag me back into the house. I twisted onto my back, my breath catching as I finally saw it clearly. A face, if it could be called that. Hollow eyes, too wide, too deep. Black pits that seemed to stretch into nothingness. A mouth that wasn't a mouth at all, but a gaping void, stretching, shifting, grinning with something that was not joy but hunger. The hands that gripped me were impossibly long, the fingers tightening as they dragged me closer, closer to the darkness that pulsed behind it. I screamed. I kicked harder, my foot connecting with something solid. The grip faltered. I scrambled forward, pulling myself toward the door with every ounce of strength I had left. My fingers grazed the threshold. Almost there. Almost. A final yank. The air left my lungs as I was pulled back, my vision going black for a moment. The last thing I saw was the open doorway, the night beyond it so close, so impossibly far away. And then the door slammed shut. Darkness swallowed me whole. Story 2. My pulse quickened as I made my way down the dimly lit hallway. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath my feet. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and dust, and each breath I took seemed to catch in my throat. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that eyes were boring into my back from the darkness that seemed to close in around me. My footsteps echoed, a haunting rhythm that only served to heighten my unease. I had never believed in the supernatural, but the atmosphere in this place was enough to make even the most skeptical person question their convictions. I had come to this abandoned mansion on a dare, a foolish attempt to prove my bravery to my friends. They had teased me for weeks, calling me a coward for refusing to enter the dilapidated old house at the edge of town. Now, as I stood in its eerie, decaying corridors, I wished I had listened to my instincts and stayed far away. The house had a dark history, one that was whispered about in hushed tones by the townspeople. Stories of disappearances and unexplained occurrences had plagued this place for decades, but I had dismissed them as mere superstition. Now, as the darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides, I couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to those tales. I reached for my flashlight, the small beam of light, providing a feeble sense of security as I continued to explore the mansion's twisted, labyrinthine passages. My hand trembled as I gripped the flashlight tighter, the cold metal a stark contrast to the clammy sweat that coated my skin. I stumbled upon a door at the end of the hallway, its once ornate carvings now obscured by layers of grime and neglect. With a deep breath, I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest as I stepped into the room beyond. The room was shrouded in darkness, the only illumination coming from the weak beam of my flashlight. As I swept the light across the space, I saw that it was filled with old furniture, covered in dust and cobwebs. An ancient, moth-eaten rug lay in the center of the floor, its colors long since faded. I took a cautious step forward, the floorboards creaking ominously beneath me. Suddenly, a shadow flickered in the corner of my vision, and I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there, just the oppressive darkness and the weight of my own fear. I tried to steady my breathing, to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. I knew I had to get out of there, but my curiosity got the better of me. I moved deeper into the room, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. As I approached the far corner, I noticed a large, ornate mirror, its surface tarnished and cracked. The frame was adorned with intricate carvings, depicting scenes of torment and despair. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight illuminating the mirror's surface. As I gazed into the glass, I saw my reflection staring back at me, eyes wide with fear. But there was something else, something lurking just behind my reflection, a shadowy figure that seemed to move with a life of its own. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look behind me, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, save for the dust and cobwebs. I turned back to the mirror, my heart racing as the shadowy figure began to take shape. It was a tall, gaunt figure, its eyes dark and hollow, its mouth twisted into a sinister grin, and I could feel the malevolent energy emanating from it. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The room was plunged into darkness, and I could hear the sound of my own labored breathing, the only noise in the oppressive silence. I scrambled to pick up the flashlight, my fingers fumbling in the darkness. When I finally managed to grasp it, I turned it on, the beam of light slicing through the gloom. But the mirror was empty, the shadowy figure gone. I tried to convince myself that it had been a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew that something was very wrong. I needed to get out of this house, to escape the suffocating darkness that seemed to close in around me. I hurried back down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. As I reached the front door, I felt a sudden, cold breeze brush against my skin, and I shivered. The door was heavy, its hinges rusted and stiff. I pushed against it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to set in, my heart pounding in my chest as I struggled to open the door. I glanced around, searching for another way out, but the darkness seemed to swallow up any potential escape routes. Suddenly, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, a voice that seemed to come from the very walls of the house. It was a low, guttural sound, filled with malice and despair. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was enough to send chills down my spine. I turned to face the source of the sound, my flashlight shaking in my trembling hand. The hallway stretched out before me, seemingly endless and filled with shadows that danced and writhed in the dim light. As I took a hesitant step forward, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the walls and filling my mind with a sense of dread. I felt as though I was being drawn deeper into the darkness, pulled by an unseen force that I couldn't resist. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but the oppressive atmosphere made it difficult to think clearly. In the distance, I saw a faint glimmer of light, a small beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. I hurried toward it, my footsteps quickening as the whispering reached a fever pitch. The light grew brighter as I approached, and I could see that it was coming from an open door at the end of the hallway. I hesitated for a moment, my instinct screaming at me to turn back, to find another way out, but I knew that I had no choice. I had to keep moving, to push forward and escape this nightmare. As I stepped through the door, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with dusty, old books and strange, archaic artifacts. In the center of the room stood a tall, hooded figure, its back turned to me. The figure seemed to be engrossed in a large, leather-bound book, its long, bony fingers tracing the faded words on the pages. I felt a surge of fear and curiosity, my mind racing with questions. Who was this figure? What were they doing in this forsaken place? I took a cautious step forward, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. The figure tensed, its head snapping up as if it had sensed my presence. Slowly, it turned to face me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The hood obscured its features, but I could see the glint of its eyes, cold and piercing. The figure raised a hand, and I felt an invisible force grip me, holding me in place. I struggled against it, but it was as if my body was no longer under my control. The figure spoke, its voice low and resonant, filled with an ancient, otherworldly power. "You should not have come here," it said, its words sending shivers through me. "This place is cursed, and those who enter are doomed to suffer the same fate as those who came before." I felt a wave of despair wash over me, the weight of the figure's words pressing down on my soul. I knew I had to escape, to find a way out before it was too late. I mustered all my strength, breaking free from the invisible force that held me. I turned and fled, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced down the hallway. The whispering voices grew louder, more frantic, as if they were trying to hold me back. But I pushed forward, desperate to escape the clutches of this cursed place. As I reached the front door once more, I felt a sudden surge of energy. The door groaned and creaked as I pushed against it, and finally, it swung open. I stumbled outside, the cold night air a welcome relief from the oppressive atmosphere of the mansion. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the property, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I glanced back at the mansion, its dark silhouette looming ominously against the night sky. I knew I had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death, but the experience had left its mark on me. Even now, as I try to put the events of that night behind me. I can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of that house, that the darkness has taken root within me. I can still hear the whispers, faint and distant, but always there, a constant reminder of the terror I faced. I know that I can never truly escape the curse of that mansion, that it will haunt me for the rest of my days. But I also know that I must be vigilant, to keep the darkness at bay and prevent it from consuming me entirely. I am, in one word, changed. The events of that harrowing night left an indelible mark on my soul, altering the very fabric of my existence. I can no longer walk through the world with the same naive bravado that once characterized my every step. Even the most mundane of surroundings now seem to pulse with hidden malevolence, a constant reminder of the darkness that once sought to consume me. In the days and weeks that followed my escape from the mansion, I struggled to reconcile the reality of my experience with the logical, rational mind that had always guided me. I pored over every detail, replaying the events in my head, trying to find some explanation that would make sense of the nightmare I had lived through. But no matter how many times I examined it, the truth remained. I had encountered something beyond the realm of human understanding, a force that defied all logic and reason. I began to notice strange occurrences in my everyday life, subtle but undeniable signs that the darkness had not released its hold on me. Objects would move on their own, shadows would shift and writhe in the corners of my vision, and the whispering voices that had haunted me in the mansion seemed to follow me wherever I went. At first, I tried to dismiss these phenomena as mere figments of my imagination, the lingering effects of my trauma. But as the incidents grew more frequent and more intense, I could no longer deny that something sinister had followed me from that cursed place. I sought solace in the company of my friends, hoping that their presence would provide some measure of comfort and security. But even in their familiar, reassuring company, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that some unseen force was lurking just beyond the edge of my perception. My friends noticed the change in me, their teasing and laughter giving way to concern and unease. They tried to help me, to pull me out of the darkness that had engulfed me, but their efforts were in vain. The connection I had formed with the mansion's malevolent presence was too strong, its tendrils too deeply entwined with my very being. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself growing increasingly isolated, retreating into the safety of my own home in a desperate attempt to escape the relentless terror that haunted me. But no matter where I went, the darkness followed, an ever-present shadow that seemed to feed on my fear and despair. I tried to find answers, to uncover some way to break free from the curse that had ensnared me. But every avenue I explored only led to more questions, more dead ends. In my search for answers, I turned to the internet, hoping to find some clue or insight that would help me understand the nature of the evil that had attached itself to me. I scoured forums and websites dedicated to the paranormal, reading countless accounts of similar experiences and the methods others had used to combat the forces that tormented them. But no matter how many stories I read or how many rituals and protections I tried, nothing seemed to work. The darkness clung to me, an inescapable shadow that grew ever more oppressive with each passing day. Desperation drove me to seek out the help of professionals, paranormal investigators and exorcists who claimed to have the knowledge and expertise to rid me of my unwanted companion. They performed their rituals and cleansings, chanting ancient incantations and burning sage to banish the evil from my life. But their efforts were futile, the darkness merely laughing in the face of their attempts to dispel it. Each failure only served to deepen my despair, to convince me that I was doomed to live out the rest of my days in the grip of this malevolent force. As my mental and emotional state deteriorated, I found myself plagued by vivid, nightmarish visions that would invade my waking moments, blurring the line between reality and the realm of nightmares. The shadowy figure from the mirror would appear before me, its hollow eyes filled with a malevolent glee as it whispered terrible secrets and promises of suffering in my ear. I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath, the echoes of its voice still ringing in my ears. My physical health began to suffer as well, the constant stress and fear taking a toll on my body. I lost weight, my once healthy frame growing gaunt and frail. Sleep became an elusive luxury, each night a battle against the terrors that awaited me in the darkness. I knew that I couldn't go on like this, that I had to find a way to break free from the curse before it consumed me entirely. In a moment of clarity, I realized that the key to my salvation lay within the mansion itself. It was there that the curse had taken hold of me, and it was there that I would have to confront the darkness if I ever hoped to be free of it. The thought of returning to that place filled me with a deep, bone-chilling dread, but I knew that I had no other choice. I had to face the source of my torment head-on, to confront the evil that had ensnared me, and find a way to break its hold. I spent days preparing for my return to the mansion, gathering supplies, and researching every possible method of protection and banishment. I armed myself with every conceivable tool and talisman, determined to be ready for whatever horrors awaited me. As I packed my bag, my hands trembled with a mixture of fear and resolve. I knew that this would be the most dangerous undertaking of my life, but I also knew that it was my only chance to reclaim my sanity and my freedom. The day of my return to the mansion dawned gray and overcast, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. I steeled myself for the journey, taking one last look at the familiar comforts of my home before setting out. The walk to the mansion felt like a death march, each step weighed down by the crushing fear that gnawed at my insides. As I approached the imposing, decaying structure, my heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed the terror that gripped me. The front door, once a barrier that had refused to yield, now seemed to beckon me, as if the house itself was aware of my return and eager to resume its torment. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest as I stepped inside. The familiar, oppressive darkness closed in around me, and I felt the weight of the malevolent presence pressing down on my soul. I moved cautiously through the mansion's corridors, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of decay and mildew, and every creak and groan of the floorboards sent shivers down my spine. I could feel the darkness watching me, its malevolent gaze a constant reminder of the danger I faced. I steeled myself, refusing to let my fear overwhelm me as I pressed on, determined to confront the source of my torment. As I approached the room where I had first encountered the shadowy figure, I felt a surge of dread wash over me. The door loomed before me, a portal to the unknown that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. I hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling on the doorknob as I gathered my courage. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was exactly as I remembered it, filled with dust and cobwebs, the ancient furniture shrouded in darkness. The mirror still stood in the far corner, its surface tarnished and cracked, but now it seemed to radiate a malevolent energy that sent chills down my spine. I approached it cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the intricate carvings on the frame, each one depicting scenes of torment and despair. As I gazed into the mirror, I saw my reflection staring back at me, eyes wide with fear. But this time, the shadowy figure was not content to remain in the glass. It stepped forward, emerging from the mirror with a fluid, unnatural grace. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me, paralyzing me in place. The figure's sinister grin widened as it advanced, its bony fingers reaching out to grasp me. I struggled to move, to break free from its grip, but my body refused to obey. The darkness seemed to close in around me, suffocating me with its malevolent presence. I could feel the cold, clammy touch of the figure's hands on my skin, and I knew that I was facing the very embodiment of the evil that had haunted me. In that moment of utter despair, I remembered the talismans and protections I had brought with me. Summoning all my strength, I reached into my bag and pulled out a small vial of holy water, throwing it at the figure with all my might. The water struck the figure, and it recoiled with a hiss, its flesh sizzling and smoking where the water had touched it. The malevolent energy that had surrounded me seemed to waver, and I felt a glimmer of hope. I seized the opportunity, pulling out a crucifix and holding it before me like a shield. The figure snarled and backed away, its hollow eyes filled with rage. I chanted the incantations I had learned, my voice trembling but resolute. The air seemed to crackle with energy as I continued, the darkness retreating before the power of my words. The figure writhed and twisted, its form growing more insubstantial with each passing moment. I could feel the darkness losing its grip on me, its malevolent presence weakening. With one final, desperate effort, I shouted the last words of the incantation, and the figure let out a terrible, ear-piercing scream. It dissolved into a cloud of shadow and mist, dissipating into the air as the oppressive atmosphere. As the oppressive atmosphere began to dissipate, I felt a glimmer of hope. The darkness that had clung to me for so long was weakening, its grip loosening with every passing moment. I continued to chant the incantations, my voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. The air around me seemed to crackle with energy, the malevolent presence retreating before the power of my words. The shadowy figure writhed and twisted, its form growing more insubstantial by the second. With one final, desperate effort, I shouted the last words of the incantation, and the figure let out a terrible, ear-piercing scream. It dissolved into a cloud of shadow and mist, dissipating into the air as the oppressive atmosphere lifted. I stood there, panting and trembling, my heart racing as the reality of my victory sank in. But even as the darkness retreated, I knew that my battle was not yet over. The mansion still held many secrets, and I could feel the lingering presence of other malevolent entities within its walls. I had to uncover the truth behind the curse that had plagued this place, and find a way to put an end to it once and for all. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the challenges that lay ahead. With renewed determination, I began to explore the mansion, searching for clues that would help me understand the nature of the evil that had taken root here. The hall seemed to stretch on endlessly, each room filled with dust and decay, the air heavy with the weight of forgotten memories. As I delved deeper into the mansion, I discovered a hidden passage behind a large, ornate tapestry. The passage was narrow and dark, the walls lined with ancient, crumbling stone. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stepped into the passage, the oppressive silence pressing in on me from all sides. I knew that whatever lay at the end of this corridor would hold the key to unraveling the mystery of the mansion's curse. The passage seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in a labyrinthine maze that left me disoriented and uneasy. The air grew colder and more stagnant the deeper I went, and I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on me. I pressed on, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls as I navigated the treacherous path. Finally, I reached a heavy, iron door at the end of the passage. The door was covered in strange, arcane symbols that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. I hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling on the doorknob as I gathered my courage. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room beyond was vast and cavernous, its walls lined with shelves filled with dusty tomes and bizarre artifacts. In the center of the room stood an ancient stone altar, its surface covered in strange, indecipherable markings. The air was thick with the scent of decay and ancient power, and I could feel the malevolent presence of the entities that had plagued the mansion. As I approached the altar, I noticed a large, leather-bound book lying open on its surface. The pages were filled with strange, arcane symbols that seemed to writhe and twist before my eyes. I could feel the dark energy emanating from the book, a palpable force that sent shivers down my spine. I knew that this book held the key to understanding the curse and finding a way to break it. I began to study the book, my eyes scanning the symbols as I tried to make sense of the ancient language. The more I read, the more I began to understand the true nature of the curse that had plagued the mansion. It was a dark and powerful force, bound to the very stones of the building by a malevolent entity that had been summoned centuries ago. The entity fed on the fear and despair of those who entered the mansion, drawing strength from their suffering and using it to maintain its hold on the world. I realized that the only way to break the curse was to confront the entity and banish it from the mansion. But to do so, I would need to gather the necessary tools and perform a ritual that would sever the entity's ties to this world. The book provided detailed instructions on how to perform the ritual, but it was clear that it would be a dangerous and difficult task. I would need to gather several rare and powerful artifacts, each one imbued with the energy needed to counteract the entity's malevolent power. With the knowledge I had gained from the book, I set out to gather the artifacts, determined to put an end to the curse once and for all. The first artifact was a crystal amulet, said to be hidden in a secret chamber beneath the mansion. I carefully followed the instructions in the book, searching for hidden switches and concealed passages that would lead me to the chamber. After hours of searching, I finally discovered a hidden trapdoor in the floor of one of the mansion's many rooms. I pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into the darkness below. Taking a deep breath, I steeled myself for the journey ahead and began to descend the stairs, my flashlight illuminating the ancient stone walls as I made my way down. The air grew colder and more oppressive the deeper I went, and I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on me. But I pressed on, determined to find the amulet and put an end to the curse. Finally, I reached the bottom of the staircase and found myself in a small, dimly lit chamber. The walls were covered in strange, arcane symbols, and in the center of the room stood a pedestal upon which rested the crystal amulet. I approached the pedestal cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest as I reached out to take the amulet. As my fingers closed around the cool, smooth surface of the crystal, I felt a surge of energy course through me. The amulet seemed to pulse with a vibrant, otherworldly light, and I knew that I had found the first piece of the puzzle. With the amulet in hand, I made my way back up the staircase and began to search for the remaining artifacts. Each one was hidden in a different part of the mansion, and each one presented its own set of challenges and dangers. But with the knowledge I had gained from the book and the power of the amulet to guide me, I was able to locate and retrieve each artifact in turn. The second artifact was a silver dagger, said to be hidden in a crypt beneath the mansion's grounds. The crypt was a dark and foreboding place, filled with the remains of those who had once lived in the mansion and fallen victim to its curse. I navigated the narrow, winding passages of the crypt, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls as I searched for the dagger. Finally, I discovered a small, ornate chest hidden in a recess in the wall. I pried it open, revealing the silver dagger nestled within. The blade seemed to gleam with an inner light, and I could feel its power resonating with the energy of the amulet. With the dagger in hand, I made my way back to the surface. The weight of the artifacts a constant reminder of the task that lay ahead. The third artifact was a book of ancient spells, said to be hidden in the mansion's library. The library was a vast, sprawling room filled with rows upon rows of dusty tomes and ancient manuscripts. I spent hours searching the shelves, my fingers tracing the spines of the books as I scanned the titles for any hint of the spellbook. Finally, I discovered a hidden compartment behind one of the shelves, revealing the ancient spellbook within. The pages were filled with arcane symbols and incantations, each one a key to unlocking the power needed to banish the entity. With the spellbook in hand, I felt a renewed sense of determination, knowing that I was one step closer to breaking the curse. The final artifact was a set of ancient runestones, said to be hidden in a secret garden behind the mansion. The garden was overgrown and wild, the once carefully tended plants now twisted and gnarled with neglect. I carefully navigated the tangled undergrowth, searching for any sign of the runestones. After hours of searching, I discovered a small, hidden alcove beneath the large, ancient tree. The runestones were nestled within, their surfaces covered in intricate carvings that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. As I took the runestones in my hands, I felt a surge of energy course through me, and I knew that I had finally gathered all the necessary tools to perform the ritual. With the artifacts in hand, I returned to the chamber beneath the mansion, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. I carefully arranged the artifacts on the altar, following the instructions in the book to the letter. As I began to chant the incantations, I could feel the energy in the room shifting, the air growing heavy with the weight of ancient power. The malevolent presence that had plagued the mansion seemed to awaken, its dark energy swirling around me as I continued the ritual. I could feel the entity's anger and fear, its desperate attempts to maintain its hold on the world. But I pressed on, my voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. As I completed the final incantation, the air seemed to crackle with energy, and the darkness that had surrounded me began to dissolve. The entity let out a terrible, ear-piercing scream, its form writhing and twisting as it was banished from the mansion. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and I felt a surge of relief as the darkness was finally driven away. I stood there, panting and trembling, my heart racing as the reality of my victory sank in. The curse that had plagued the mansion for centuries had been broken, and the malevolent entity that had. I stood there, panting and trembling, my heart racing as the reality of my victory sank in. The curse that had plagued the mansion for centuries had been broken, and the malevolent entity that had tormented me had been banished. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and I felt a surge of relief as the darkness was finally driven away. But even as I basked in the sense of triumph, I knew that my journey was not yet over. There were still questions that needed answers, and mysteries that remained unsolved. As I looked around the chamber, the remnants of the dark energy still lingering in the air, I realized that I needed to understand the origins of the curse and the entity that had haunted this place. I needed to uncover the history of the mansion and the events that had led to its descent into darkness. With this newfound determination, I began to search the room for any clues or documents that might shed light on the mansion's past. I scoured the shelves, examining the dusty tomes and bizarre artifacts that lined the walls. Among the ancient manuscripts and arcane relics, I discovered a leather-bound journal that seemed to have been written by the mansion's original owner. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting was difficult to decipher, but I was determined to unravel the story contained within. The journal detailed the life of a man named Edward Blackwood, a wealthy and ambitious nobleman who had built the mansion as a symbol of his power and influence. Edward's ambitions, however, extended beyond the material world. He had become obsessed with the occult, delving into forbidden knowledge and dark rituals in his quest for immortality and ultimate power. The journal recounted his experiments and the lengths he had gone to in order to summon and bind powerful entities to his will. It soon became clear that Edward's reckless pursuit of power had led to the summoning of the malevolent entity that had haunted the mansion for centuries. In his desperation to achieve immortality, Edward had performed a ritual that had gone horribly wrong, binding the entity to the mansion and unleashing a curse that would plague the house and its inhabitants for generations. The journal described the initial horror as the entity began to wreak havoc, feeding on the fear and despair of those who dared to enter the mansion's cursed halls. As I continued to read, I discovered that Edward had eventually realized the enormity of his mistake and had sought to find a way to undo the curse he had unleashed. He had devoted the rest of his life to researching ancient texts and performing countless rituals, desperate to find a way to banish the entity and break the curse. However, his efforts had been in vain, and he had ultimately succumbed to the darkness that he had brought upon himself and his home. The journal ended abruptly, with Edward's final, despairing entry detailing his last-ditch effort to banish the entity. It seemed that he had died in the attempt, his soul consumed by the very darkness he had sought to control. The realization that I was not the first to confront the entity filled me with a sense of both dread and determination. I knew that I had succeeded where Edward had failed, but I also understood that the knowledge contained within his journal was invaluable. It could help me ensure that the curse would never return, and that the mansion would be free from the darkness that had plagued it for so long. Armed with this newfound knowledge, I made my way back to the surface, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. The mansion, once a place of terror and despair, now felt lighter, as if the very walls had been cleansed of the malevolent presence that had haunted them. I knew that there was still much work to be done, but I felt a sense of hope and purpose that had been missing for so long. Over the following weeks, I dedicated myself to studying Edward's journal and the other ancient texts I had found in the mansion. I sought to understand the nature of the rituals he had performed and the forces he had sought to control. I reached out to scholars and experts in the occult, sharing my findings and seeking their guidance. Together, we pieced together the puzzle of the mansion's dark history and worked to ensure that the curse would never return. As I delved deeper into the arcane knowledge contained within the texts, I began to develop a newfound respect for the power and danger of the occult. I realized that, while the darkness could be harnessed and controlled, it was a force that demanded the utmost caution and respect. The mansion's history had taught me that the pursuit of power, without regard for the consequences, could lead to devastating and irreversible consequences. In my quest to understand the dark forces that had plagued the mansion, I also sought to restore the house to its former glory. I enlisted the help of historians, architects, and craftsmen to repair the damage that had been wrought by centuries of neglect and decay. Together, We worked to preserve the mansion's history while ensuring that it would no longer be a place of fear and suffering. As the restoration progressed, I felt a sense of accomplishment and pride in the work we were doing. The mansion, once a symbol of darkness and despair, was being transformed into a place of beauty and light. I knew that the process would take time, but I was committed to seeing it through to the end. Throughout this journey, I also took the time to reflect on my own experiences and the impact they had on me. The encounter with the malevolent entity had changed me in profound ways, forcing me to confront my deepest fears and pushing me to the limits of my endurance. But it had also made me stronger, more resilient, and more determined to overcome any obstacle that stood in my way. As the restoration neared completion, I began to consider the future of the mansion and the legacy it would leave behind. I wanted it to be a place where people could come to learn about its history, to appreciate the beauty of its architecture, and to understand the importance of respecting the forces that lie beyond our understanding. I envisioned the mansion as a center for education and research, where scholars and enthusiasts could come together to study the occult and the lessons of the past. To that end, I established a foundation dedicated to preserving the mansion and promoting the study of the occult. I invited experts from around the world to contribute their knowledge and insights, and I opened the doors of the mansion to the public, offering guided tours and educational programs. The response was overwhelming, and the mansion quickly became a respected and renowned institution in the field of occult studies. As the years passed, I continued to dedicate myself to the work of the foundation, always mindful of the lessons I had learned during my time in the mansion. I never forgot the darkness that had once plagued the house, and I remained vigilant against any potential threats that might arise. I knew that the forces we were dealing with were powerful and unpredictable, and I was determined to ensure that the mansion would never again fall victim to the malevolent entities that had haunted it for so long. The old house at the end of Hollow Creek Road had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. It stood there like a forgotten relic, its paint peeling, its windows black and lifeless. The townsfolk never spoke of it, not even in hushed whispers. It was as if the house did not exist in their minds, as though acknowledging it would bring something terrible upon them. But for me, it was an obsession. Every time I walked past it, I felt something watching me from the shadows within. A presence, an invitation, a warning. I don't know what compelled me that night. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the way the full moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows across the overgrown yard. Or maybe it was the whisper I thought I heard when I stopped in front of the rusted iron gate. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but I could have sworn it spoke my name. My breath hitched. I scanned my surroundings. Nothing. Just the road, empty and silent, stretching into the darkness behind me. My heart pounded as I pushed open the gate. It groaned in protest, rust flaking off as I stepped inside. The overgrown grass swallowed my feet with each step, as though the earth itself didn't want me to proceed. The front door loomed before me, slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting. The air around me felt heavier, thick with something unseen but undeniably present. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and nudged the door open. The inside was worse than I had imagined. Dust coated every surface, the air thick with the scent of rot and something else, something metallic. The floor creaked beneath my weight, and I hesitated, listening. Silence. Too much silence. Even the wind that had howled outside was now absent, as if the house had swallowed all sound. I took a cautious step forward, the old wood groaning beneath my feet. A shiver ran down my spine as I passed the decaying furniture, the faded wallpaper peeling in long, curling strips. My eyes caught a staircase leading upwards, its steps worn and splintered. A strange sensation crept over me, a feeling that something was up there, something waiting. The whisper returned, clear this time, just beyond my ear. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't my imagination. It was a voice, low and rasping, calling my name. I turned sharply, my breath catching. The room behind me was empty, but the feeling of being watched intensified. My fingers curled into fists, nails biting into my palms. I should leave. I should turn around and walk out the way I came. But my feet didn't move. Instead, I found myself climbing the stairs, each step groaning louder than the last, as if warning me to stop. The hallway upstairs was worse than the rooms below. The walls were smeared with something dark, almost black in the dim light. The air was thick with the stench of decay. My eyes landed on a door at the end of the hall. Unlike the others, which were left open, this one was closed. Locked even. A strange sensation stirred in my chest, something between dread and compulsion. I pressed my hand against the door. It was ice cold beneath my palm. My breathing grew shallow as I twisted the knob. Locked. I hesitated, then knocked. The sound echoed down the hall. Silence. Then, a scraping noise from the other side. My pulse slammed against my ribs. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to run. But the door creaked open. The darkness inside was suffocating. It seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing the weak moonlight that filtered in from the hallway. My hand trembled as I reached for my phone, its flashlight barely piercing the void. Something moved at the edge of the beam, just a flicker, barely there. I swallowed hard, stepping inside. The floor was damp. My shoes made a sickening squelching sound. The air was colder than anywhere else in the house, pressing against me like unseen hands. I swung the light around, my breath hitching when it landed on the far wall. Words were carved into the wood, deep and jagged, as if scratched by something inhuman. Don't look at it. The whisper came again, but this time, it wasn't calling my name. It was a plea. A desperate, terrified whisper. Don't turn around. The hairs on my neck stood on end. My breath came in shallow gasps. I felt it now behind me. A presence. Heavy. Looming. The temperature plummeted, ice crawling up my spine. My body refused to move. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, to never look back. But then I heard the breathing, right behind me. Slow, raspy. A cold breath brushed against my ear. I ran. I don't remember turning. I don't remember what I saw. But I remember the feeling, the crushing weight of something old and malevolent pressing against me, chasing me down the hallway, down the stairs, through the rotting doorway, and into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached my house, slamming the door shut behind me, my chest heaving, my vision blurred with terror. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my room, every light on, my back pressed against the wall. But the whisper didn't leave me. It followed me, curled into my ears like a snake. And when I finally found the courage to close my eyes, I saw it, not in a dream, not in a nightmare, but in the reflection of my bedroom window. A figure, standing in the dark, staring at me, and it whispered, so softly, so cruelly, "You looked." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My body felt frozen, paralyzed by a fear so raw and deep that it coiled around my bones like a vice. The figure in the window didn't shift, didn't waver. It was just there, a tall, shadowy presence standing against the darkness, watching. The whisper had faded, but its presence lingered in my ears, like an echo trapped in my skull. I didn't want to turn away. I knew if I did, if I so much as blinked, it would move. I don't know how I knew that, but every fiber of my being screamed it at me. So I stared. My eyes burned, my lungs ached from holding my breath, but I didn't look away. Seconds stretched into minutes. The room around me remained silent, save for the ticking of the old clock on my nightstand. It felt like a countdown, though I didn't know to what. My mind raced with half-formed thoughts, desperate rationalizations that crumbled under the weight of the thing in the window. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't my reflection. I knew what I saw, and it was real. Too real. Then, without warning, it moved. A slow, deliberate tilt of the head, the motion unnatural, jerky, as if the thing wasn't used to movement. My breath hitched in my throat, my muscles locked. A primal terror overtook me, a feeling so ancient and instinctual that I nearly collapsed under it. The figure's head continued to tilt, too far, far beyond what was humanly possible, the neck bending at an impossible angle. A low creak filled the silence, like bones shifting, snapping into place. The darkness around it seemed to pulse, to shift as if it were alive, as if it were breathing. I scrambled backward, my body finally responding, and fell onto my bed. My hands gripped the sheets so tightly my knuckles ached. The moment I moved, the thing in the window straightened. Then it took a step forward. My stomach dropped. The glass didn't separate us anymore. It was closer, inside the room, standing just at the edge of the shadows, where my bedside lamp's weak glow ended. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. My throat was locked, my breath shallow, my heart hammering against my ribs like a wild, desperate animal. It stood there, unmoving, featureless except for the hollow darkness, where its eyes should have been. The whisper returned, softer now, almost gentle. "You looked." The voice wasn't human. It was layered, distant yet too close, like a chorus of voices speaking at once, some high, some low, some too distorted to recognize. The words slithered through the air, wrapping around me, tightening. Then the lamp flickered. Darkness swallowed the room in an instant. I felt it surge toward me before I saw it. A rush of cold, the feeling of something unseen rushing forward. I threw myself off the bed, crawling backward, my fingers scraping against the wooden floor. My hand fumbled for my phone. I turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but the figure was gone. The air still felt thick, suffocating, but I was alone. Or so I thought. Then the whisper came again, right beside my ear. "You can't unsee me." I bolted from my room, sprinting down the hallway, my pulse a wild drumbeat in my skull. I didn't stop running until I reached the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me. My fingers fumbled for the lock, twisting it into place. My breaths came in ragged gasps, my body trembling violently. The small, fluorescent light above the mirror flickered weakly, casting long, erratic shadows against the walls. I turned toward the sink, gripping the edges to steady myself. Then I made a mistake. I looked into the mirror. My reflection stared back, pale, wide-eyed, terror carved into every inch of my face. But it wasn't alone. Standing behind me, just over my shoulder, was the thing. No longer a shadow, no longer a distant figure. It was right there, closer than ever. And now I could see it. The face, or what was left of it. Its skin was stretched too tight, its mouth too wide, lips cracked and bleeding. The hollow pits, where its eyes should have been stared straight into mine, filled with endless, swirling darkness. Its breath, icy and putrid, ghosted against my neck. My heart stopped. Then the light went out. A scream tore from my throat, raw and desperate, but it was swallowed by the dark. The air thickened, pressing in from all sides. I stumbled back, crashing into the wall. The whisper returned, but now it was laughing, low and guttural. My vision swam, my mind spiraling into panic. I clawed at the door, fumbling with the lock, my fingers slick with sweat. The handle wouldn't budge. The walls felt like they were closing in, the room growing impossibly smaller. The whisper turned into a chant, repeating the same 3 words over and over, filling my ears, my skull, my very bones. "You looked, you looked, you looked." I don't know how I got out. My next memory was waking up on the floor of my living room, the morning light bleeding through the curtains. My head pounded, my limbs ached, but the worst part was the silence. The house was too quiet. I sat up slowly, my body stiff, my mouth dry as sandpaper. For a moment I thought, hoped, it had all been a dream, a nightmare. But when I turned my head, my blood turned to ice. My bedroom door was wide open. I hadn't left it that way. The whisper was gone, but the feeling wasn't. I could still sense it, lurking, watching. It was still here, hiding in the corners, waiting in the reflections, lingering in the shadows where the light couldn't reach. My stomach twisted. I knew then that this wasn't over. This wasn't something I could run from, something I could ignore. I had seen it, and it had seen me, and now it would never leave. That night, I covered every mirror, every reflective surface in my house. I kept the lights on. I refused to look into the darkness, but the whisper still came, curling around my ears in the dead of night, murmuring my name, reminding me of the one, unbreakable truth. Once you see it, it never stops looking back. The house had always been there, at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the town streetlights. I'd passed it 1,000 times, always in daylight, always with the sun high and the birds chirping in the trees. It was an old Victorian, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, its windows dark and hollow, like the empty sockets of a skull. I never thought much of it. It was just another relic of a time long gone, a forgotten monument to some family's faded glory. But that was before the night I decided to take the shortcut through the woods. Before I heard the whispers, it started with a sound, faint but unmistakable, like the rustle of dry leaves underfoot. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, and turned toward the source. The woods were silent, save for the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it came again, louder this time, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to rise from the ground itself. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. I took a step back, my eyes scanning the shadows, searching for something, anything, that could explain the noise. But there was nothing, just the trees, their gnarled limbs twisting toward the sky, and the darkness, thick and impenetrable. I turned to leave, to retrace my steps and take the long way home, but something stopped me. A voice, soft and melodic, called out from the direction of the house. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to freeze me in place. My skin prickled, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I told myself to run, to get as far away from that place as I could, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the voice had wrapped itself around me, pulling me closer, drawing me in. Against my better judgment, I took a step forward, then another, until I was standing at the edge of the property, staring up at the house. The front door was ajar, the darkness inside seeming to pulse and writhe like a living thing. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a start that it was calling my name. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest tight with fear, but I couldn't stop myself. I climbed the steps, each one creaking beneath my weight, and pushed the door open. The air inside was thick and heavy, smelling of mildew and something else, something metallic and sharp. I stepped into the foyer, my eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. The walls were lined with portraits, their eyes following me as I moved deeper into the house. The voice led me to a staircase, its steps warped and splintered with age. I climbed slowly, my hand gripping the banister so tightly my knuckles turned white. The second floor was even darker than the first, the shadows so dense they seemed to swallow the light from my phone. I followed the voice down a narrow hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet underfoot. The air grew colder with each step, my breath visible in the dim light. I reached the end of the hall and found myself standing in front of a door, its surface scarred with deep gouges, as if something had tried to claw its way out. The voice was coming from behind the door, soft and pleading, begging me to open it. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, my mind screaming at me to stop, to turn back, but I couldn't. I turned the knob and pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was small, its walls covered in peeling wallpaper, the floor littered with broken furniture and shattered glass. In the center of the room was a chair, its back to me, and sitting in the chair was a figure, its head bowed as if in prayer. The voice stopped, the silence that followed so complete it was deafening. I took a step forward, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the figure could hear it. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. I took another step, then another, until I was close enough to reach out and touch it. My hand hovered in the air, trembling, as I reached for the figure's shoulder. The moment my fingers made contact, the figure's head snapped up, and I stumbled back, a scream caught in my throat. Its face was a twisted mask of agony, its eyes wide and unseeing, its mouth stretched in a silent scream. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. I spun around, my back pressed against the door, my eyes darting around the room for another way out. The figure was gone, the chair empty, but the air was thick with the scent of decay. I fumbled for the doorknob, my hand slick with sweat, but it wouldn't turn. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing closer, the shadows deepening. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, more urgent, and I realized with a sinking feeling that they weren't coming from the room. They were coming from inside my head. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in that room, the whispers growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. I don't know how I finally managed to wrench the door open and stumble out into the hallway. I don't even remember running down the stairs and out of the house, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. All I know is that I made it home, my body trembling, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. I told myself it was a nightmare, a trick of the mind, but deep down, I knew the truth. The house wasn't empty. Something was there, something old and hungry, and it had seen me. It had called to me. And now, no matter how far I ran, no matter how many doors I locked, I could still hear its voice, whispering in the dark, waiting for me to return. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination, a product of exhaustion or stress, but the memory of that room, of the figure in the chair, clung to me like a second skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was following me, just out of sight. Every shadow seemed to move when I turned my head. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps. I stopped sleeping, afraid of what I might see if I closed my eyes. The whispers never stopped, their voices growing louder, more insistent, until I could barely hear my own thoughts. I tried to distract myself, to focus on anything but the house and the thing that lived inside it, but it was no use. The house was always there, lurking at the edge of my mind, its dark windows staring at me like accusing eyes. I started to notice things, small things at first, that I couldn't explain. Objects would move when I wasn't looking, their new positions just slightly off from where I'd left them. My reflection in the mirror would sometimes flicker, its expression twisted into something unrecognizable. And then there were the dreams. Every night, without fail, I would find myself back in that room, standing in front of the chair, the figure's head slowly rising to meet my gaze. I would wake up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat, the whispers still echoing in my ears. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I was losing myself, piece by piece, to whatever was in that house. I had to go back, to confront it, to find out what it wanted from me. The thought filled me with dread, but I knew I didn't have a choice. If I didn't, it would keep pulling me back, bit by bit, until there was nothing left of me. The night I returned to the house, the air was thick with the promise of rain. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting long shadows across the ground. I stood at the edge of the woods, staring up at the house, its silhouette looming against the dark sky. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a reminder of the danger I was walking into. But I couldn't turn back. I had to know. I crossed the property slowly, my footsteps muffled by the thick grass. The house seemed larger up close, its walls stretching up into the night like the sides of a tomb. The front door was still ajar, just as I'd left it, the darkness inside seeming to pulse and writhe. I took a deep breath, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. The moment I stepped inside, the air grew colder, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms, and forced myself to move forward. The foyer was just as I remembered it, the portraits on the walls watching me with their hollow eyes. I could feel their gaze on me, heavy and accusing, as I made my way to the staircase. The steps creaked beneath my weight, the sound echoing through the empty house. I climbed slowly, my hand gripping the banister so tightly my knuckles turned white. The second floor was even darker than before, the shadows so thick they seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. I followed the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, until I reached the door at the end. It was just as I'd left it, the surface scarred with deep gouges, the air around it cold and heavy. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the knob, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were louder now, more urgent, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. I took a deep breath, my fingers closing around the knob, and pushed the door open. The room was empty, the chair sitting in the center, its back to me. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the walls seeming to close in around me. I stepped inside, my flashlight casting long shadows across the floor. The whispers grew louder, their voices rising to a fever pitch, and I realized with a start that they were coming from the chair. I took a step forward, then another, until I was close enough to reach out and touch it. My hand trembled as I reached for the back of the chair, my breath catching in my throat. The moment my fingers made contact, The room seemed to shift, the walls twisting and warping around me. The air grew colder, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. I stumbled back, my flashlight falling from my hand and clattering to the floor. The light flickered, casting the room in a series of disjointed images, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I wasn't alone. The figure was there, standing in the corner, its head bowed, its face hidden in shadow. I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and accusing, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that it had been waiting for me. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. I spun around, my back pressed against the door, my eyes darting around the room for another way out. The figure was gone, the corner empty, but the air was thick with the scent of decay. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, more insistent, and I realized with a sinking feeling that they weren't coming from the room. They were coming from inside my head. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in that room, the whispers growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. I don't know how I finally managed to wrench the door open and stumble out into the hallway. I don't even remember running down the stairs and out of the house, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. All I know is that I made it home, my body trembling, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. I told myself it was a nightmare, a trick of the mind, but deep down, I knew the truth. The house wasn't empty. Something was there, something old and hungry, and it had seen me. It had called to me. And now, no matter how far I ran, no matter how many doors I locked, I could still hear its voice, whispering in the dark, waiting for me to return. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination, a product of exhaustion or stress, but the memory of that room, of the figure in the chair, clung to me like a second skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was following me, just out of sight. Every shadow seemed to move when I turned my head. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps. I stopped sleeping, afraid of what I might see if I closed my eyes. The whispers never stopped, their voices growing louder, more insistent, until I could barely hear my own thoughts. I tried to distract myself, to focus on anything but the house and the thing that lived inside it, but it was no use. The house was always there, lurking at the edge of my mind, its dark windows staring at me like accusing eyes. I started to notice things, small things at first, that I couldn't explain. Objects would move when I wasn't looking, their new positions just slightly off from where I'd left them. My reflection in the mirror would sometimes flicker, its expression twisted into something unrecognizable. And then there were the dreams. Every night, without fail, I would find myself back in that room, standing in front of the chair, the figure's head slowly rising to meet my gaze. I would wake up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat, the whispers still echoing in my ears. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I was losing myself, piece by piece, to whatever was in that house. I had to go back, to confront it, to find out what it wanted from me. The thought filled me with dread, but I knew I didn't have a choice. If I didn't, it would keep pulling me back, bit by bit, until there was nothing left of me. The night I returned to the house, the air was thick with the promise of rain. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting long shadows across the ground. I stood at the edge of the woods, staring up at the house, its silhouette looming against the dark sky. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a reminder of the danger I was walking into. But I couldn't turn back. I had to know. I crossed the property slowly, my footsteps muffled by the thick grass. The house seemed larger up close, its walls stretching up into the night, like the sides of a tomb. The front door was still ajar, just as I'd left it, the darkness inside seeming to pulse and writhe. I took a deep breath, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. The moment I stepped inside, the air grew colder, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms, and forced myself to move forward. The foyer was just as I remembered it, the portraits on the walls watching me with their hollow eyes. I could feel their gaze on me, heavy and accusing, as I made my way to the staircase. The steps creaked beneath my weight, the sound echoing through the empty house. I climbed slowly, my hand gripping the banister so tightly my knuckles turned white. The second floor was even darker than before, the shadows so thick they seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. I followed the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, until I reached the door at the end. It was just as I'd left it, the surface scarred with deep gouges, the air around it cold and heavy. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the knob, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were louder now, more urgent, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. I took a deep breath, my fingers closing around the knob, and pushed the door open. The room was empty, the chair sitting in the center, its back to me. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the walls seeming to close in around me. I stepped inside, my flashlight casting long shadows across the floor. The whispers grew louder, their voices rising to a fever pitch, and I realized with a start that they were coming from the chair. I took a step forward, then another, until I was close enough to reach out and touch it. My hand trembled as I reached for the back of the chair, my breath catching in my throat. The moment my fingers made contact, the room seemed to shift, the walls twisting and warping around me. The air grew colder, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. I stumbled back, my flashlight falling from my hand and clattering to the floor. The light flickered, casting the room in a series of disjointed images, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I wasn't alone. The figure was there, standing in the corner, its head bowed, its face hidden in shadow. I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and accusing, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that it had been waiting for me. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. I spun around, my back pressed against the door, my eyes darting around the room for another way out. The figure was gone, the corner empty, but the air was thick with the scent of decay. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, more insistent, and I realized with a sinking feeling that they weren't coming from the room. They were coming from inside my head. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in that room, the whispers growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. I don't know how I finally managed to wrench the door open and stumble out into the hallway. I don't even remember running down the stairs and out of the house, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. All I know is that I made it home, my body trembling, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. I told myself it was a nightmare, a trick of the mind, but deep down, I knew the truth. The house wasn't empty. Something was there.
I never believed in ghosts. The idea always seemed like a relic of childhood fears, something you leave behind when you grow up and understand how the world really works. But now, after everything that has happened, I can't explain what I saw in any other way. I keep telling myself it wasn't real, that it was all in my head, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I close my eyes, I still see it. I still hear it. And worst of all, I still feel it watching me. It started when I moved into the old house at the edge of town. The price was unbelievably low, almost suspiciously so, but I convinced myself I had just found a good deal. The house was old, built in the early 1900s, with peeling wallpaper and creaking wooden floors. The air inside smelled of dust and forgotten memories, but I told myself I could make it home. I spent the first few nights settling in, unpacking boxes and rearranging furniture. Everything seemed normal at first. Then, on the fourth night, I woke up to the sound of something moving in the hallway. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like footsteps dragging along the wooden floor. My heart pounded as I lay there, frozen in bed, listening. I told myself it was just the house settling, that old houses made noises all the time. But then I heard the distinct creak of my bedroom door as it shifted slightly, as if someone was standing just outside, hesitating. I held my breath, straining to hear, but the silence stretched on endlessly. I finally mustered the courage to get up and check. The hallway was empty. My bedroom door was slightly ajar, though I knew for certain I had closed it before going to bed. I shook it off and went back to sleep, telling myself I was imagining things. The next night, I woke up again, this time to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like someone was speaking just beneath their breath. I sat up, my skin prickling with unease. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was inside my room. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping it across the room. The light revealed nothing out of the ordinary, just the familiar shape of my furniture casting long, distorted shadows. The whispering stopped the moment I turned on the light. I didn't sleep after that. As the days passed, the occurrences became more frequent. Doors that I knew I had locked were found wide open. Objects moved from one place to another when I wasn't looking. The whispering returned, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but always just quiet enough that I couldn't make out the words. I started to feel like I wasn't alone, even in broad daylight. I would catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. One night, I decided to set up my phone to record while I slept. I needed to prove to myself that nothing was happening, that my mind was just playing tricks on me. I placed the phone on my nightstand, started the recording, and went to bed. The next morning, I hesitated before playing the video. My gut twisted with unease, but I had to know. The footage started normally, just me sleeping peacefully. Hours passed with nothing but the occasional shifting of my blankets. Then, around 3:14 a.m., the air in the room seemed to ripple like a distortion in the video. A shadow moved across the frame, slow and deliberate. It wasn't me. I was still fast asleep. The shadow grew darker, more defined, until it took the shape of a tall, thin figure standing at the foot of my bed. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it remain there, unmoving, just staring at me. Then, suddenly, my sleeping self twitched. I stirred as if sensing something, but I didn't wake up. The figure leaned in, its face just inches from mine. The screen went black. The recording had ended. I deleted the video immediately. I didn't want to see it again. But the knowledge of what I had captured stayed with me. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat up in bed, gripping a flashlight, waiting for something to happen. The air felt heavier, like the house itself was pressing down on me. Then, at exactly 3:14 a.m., the whispering returned. This time, it was right next to my ear. I jumped out of bed, flicking on the light, but the room was empty. My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I grabbed my phone and keys, ready to run, but as I reached for the door, it slammed shut on its own. I yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something on the other side was holding it closed. Then the whispering turned into laughter. Low, guttural laughter that sent ice through my veins. The lights flickered violently, casting erratic shadows on the walls. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so thick it felt suffocating. Then, from the corner of the room, I heard the floorboards creak. I turned slowly, dreading what I would see. There, in the shadows, stood the figure from the video. Its form was hazy, shifting as if it weren't entirely solid. But its eyes, deep, hollow voids, locked onto mine. It didn't move. It just stood there watching. I don't remember how long I stood frozen, unable to breathe, unable to think. Then, in a blink, the figure lunged forward. I screamed, throwing myself against the door, and this time it gave way. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping, and ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air burning my lungs. I turned back only once. The house was silent, dark, and still. But in the upstairs window, just barely visible in the moonlight, I saw it watching me. I haven't gone back. My belongings are still inside, but I don't care. I can't explain what happened in that house. I don't know what it wanted, but I know it's still there waiting. And worst of all, I know it's not done with me yet. The house had always been there, at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. I'd passed it 100 times, maybe more, on my way home from work, but I'd never really seen it. Not until that night. It was an old Victorian, its once grand facade now crumbling under the weight of neglect and time. The paint was peeling, the windows were dark, and the porch sagged like the spine of a tired old beast. I don't know why I stopped that night. Maybe it was the way the moonlight caught the broken glass in the upstairs window, glinting like a winking eye. Or maybe it was the sound, a faint, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest as I walked by. Whatever it was, I found myself standing at the gate, my fingers curling around the rusted iron, staring up at the house like it had called my name. The gate creaked open with a groan that made my skin crawl, but I stepped through anyway. The air was different here, thicker, as if the house had its own atmosphere. The grass beneath my feet was overgrown, each step crunching faintly against the dry blades. I told myself I was just curious, that I'd take a quick look and leave, but the closer I got to the porch, the harder it was to turn back. The front door was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it yawning wide like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Something inside me screamed to run, to leave this place and never look back. But another part of me, a deeper, darker part, whispered that I needed to see what was inside. The door swung open with a soft creak and I stepped into the foyer. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and it smelled of damp wood and something else, something metallic like blood. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor, the sound too loud in the oppressive silence. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, its pattern obscured by years of dust and decay. To my left, a staircase spiraled up into the shadows, its banisters splintered and broken. To my right, a hallway stretched into darkness, the doors along it closed tight. I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone. The sensation was so strong that I spun around, half expecting to find someone, or something, standing behind me. But there was nothing. Just the empty foyer and the faint hum that seemed to grow louder the deeper I went. I moved toward the staircase, my hand brushing against the wall for balance. The wood was rough beneath my fingers, the texture wrong somehow, as if it were alive. I shook the thought away and started up the stairs, each step groaning under my weight. The second floor was even darker than the first, the only light coming from the broken window at the end of the hall. The hum was louder here, almost a vibration in my skull, and I realized it wasn't a sound at all. It was a feeling, a presence, something that didn't belong in this world. My heart was pounding now, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I wanted to leave, but my legs kept moving, carrying me toward the last door at the end of the hall. The door was different from the others. It was newer, the wood still smooth and unblemished, the brass handle gleaming in the dim light. I reached for it, my hand trembling, and turned the knob. The door opened silently, revealing a room that shouldn't have existed. The walls were covered in mirrors, their surfaces cracked and fogged, reflecting my image back at me in fractured pieces. In the center of the room was a chair, its high back facing me. And on the floor, drawn in what looked like chalk, was a circle filled with symbols I didn't recognize. The hum was deafening now, a roar in my ears that made it hard to think. I took a step into the room, my reflection warping and twisting in the mirrors, and that's when I saw it. The chair was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it was turning toward me. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from me. My reflection in the mirrors was wrong. My face was pale, my eyes wide with terror, but there was something else there too. Something behind me, just out of sight. I spun around, but there was nothing there. When I turned back to the mirrors, the chair was facing me, and it wasn't empty anymore. The figure sitting in it was indistinct, a shadowy outline that seemed to shift and change as I stared at it. Its head was tilted to the side, as if it were studying me, and I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. The symbols on the floor began to glow, a faint, sickly light that pulsed in time with the hum. I tried to back away, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The figure leaned forward, its form solidifying, and I realized with a jolt of horror that it wasn't a stranger. It was me. Or at least it looked like me. But its eyes were wrong, black and empty, like voids that sucked in the light. It smiled, a slow, cruel smile that made my stomach churn, and then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice a perfect mimicry of my own. The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I finally found the strength to move. I turned and ran, my feet slamming against the floor as I bolted down the hall. The hum was a roar now, a cacophony that threatened to split my skull. I didn't look back, didn't dare to. I just ran down the stairs, through the foyer, and out the door. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing on the sidewalk a block away from the house. I lay there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I finally looked up, the house was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and littered with debris. I stared at it, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But deep down, I knew. The house was still there. I could feel it like a weight pressing down on my chest. And I knew it wasn't done with me. Not yet. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to convince myself it had been a nightmare, some twisted figment of my imagination brought on by stress or exhaustion. But the memory of that house, its oppressive silence, the hum that wasn't a sound, the thing in the chair, refused to fade. It clung to me like a second skin, a constant reminder that something had shifted in my world, something I couldn't explain. I avoided the street where the house had been, taking long, circuitous routes home just to steer clear of it. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, waiting for me. And then one night I heard it again. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling when the hum started. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with every passing second. My heart began to race, my palms slick with sweat. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew better. The hum wasn't coming from outside. It was inside me, vibrating in my chest, in my skull, in the very marrow of my bones. I sat up, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and that's when I saw it. Across the room, in the corner where the shadows were deepest, something moved. It was subtle, just a flicker of darkness, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand, my fingers fumbling for the switch, but before I could turn it on, the hum stopped. The silence was deafening. I sat there, frozen, my hands still on the lamp, waiting for something to happen. But the room was still, the shadows motionless. I told myself I'd imagined it, that my mind was still reeling from what had happened at the house. But as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air felt heavier, the darkness thicker, as if something had slipped into the room while I wasn't looking. I closed my eyes, trying to will myself to sleep, but every time I drifted off, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but they were there, moving across the floor, circling my bed, stopping just inches from my face. I kept my eyes shut, too afraid to look, too afraid to confirm what I already knew. Whatever had been in that house was here now, and it wasn't going to leave. The next morning, I woke up exhausted, my body aching as if I'd spent the night running. The room was empty, the shadows just shadows, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I tried to go about my day as usual, but everything felt off. The world seemed dimmer, as if the colors had been drained from it, and the hum was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to rise again. I couldn't focus at work, my mind constantly drifting back to the house, to the thing in the chair. By the time I got home, I was a wreck. I poured myself a drink, hoping to calm my nerves, but the alcohol did nothing to dull the fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at every sound, every shadow. I had to do something. But what? That night, the hum returned. It was louder this time, more insistent, and I knew I couldn't ignore it. I got out of bed, my legs trembling, and followed the sound to the living room. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I stood in the center of the room, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. In the corner, where the light from the street lamp outside barely reached, the shadows were shifting, coalescing into a shape I recognized. It was the chair. The same chair from the house, its high back facing me, the symbols on the floor glowing faintly around it. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there, but my body wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the chair as it began to turn. The figure was there again, its form indistinct, its eyes black and empty. It smiled that same cruel smile, and I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. "You shouldn't have run," it said, its voice a perfect mimicry of my own. The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I finally found the strength to move. I turned and bolted for the door, my hands fumbling with the lock. I didn't stop to grab my keys or my phone. I just ran, my bare feet slapping against the pavement as I fled into the night. The streets were empty, the air cold against my skin, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. I don't know how long I ran, but by the time I stopped, I was miles from home. My lungs were burning, my legs trembling with exhaustion, but the fear still coursed through me like a live wire. I looked around trying to get my bearings, and that's when I saw it. The house. It was there at the end of the street, its silhouette looming against the night sky. I stared at it, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of how it could be here, so far from where it had been before. But deep down I knew. The house wasn't bound by the same rules as the rest of the world. It moved, it shifted, it followed. And it wasn't going to let me go. I stood there, frozen, as the hum started again. It was louder now, more intense, and I realized it wasn't just in my head. It was coming from the house, from the shadows that seemed to writhe and twist around it. I wanted to run, to leave this place and never look back, but I knew it wouldn't matter. The house would find me again. It always did. And so, with a sense of dread that settled deep in my bones, I started walking toward it. The gate creaked open as I approached, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. The grass beneath my feet was dry and brittle, crunching softly with each step. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the hum was a roar now, a cacophony that threatened to split my skull. I stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under my weight, and reached for the door. It swung open before I could touch it, revealing the same foyer I'd seen before. The air was cold, the smell of damp wood and blood stronger than ever. I stepped inside, my heart pounding, and the door slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed through the house, a final ominous note that seemed to seal my fate. I was here now, and there was no going back. The foyer was just as I remembered it, the faded wallpaper peeling in places, the staircase spiraling up into the shadows. The hum was louder here, more intense, and I felt it in my chest, in my skull, in the very marrow of my bones. I moved toward the staircase, my hand brushing against the wall for balance. The wood was rough beneath my fingers, the texture wrong somehow, as if it were alive. I shook the thought away and started up the stairs, each step groaning under my weight. The second floor was even darker than the first, the only light coming from the broken window at the end of the hall. The hum was deafening now, a roar in my ears that made it hard to think. I moved toward the last door at the end of the hall, my legs trembling with every step. The door was open, just as it had been before, and the room beyond it was the same. The walls were covered in mirrors, their surfaces cracked and fogged, reflecting my image back at me in fractured pieces. The chair was there, in the center of the room, its high back facing me. The symbols on the floor glowed faintly, their light pulsing in time with the hum. I stepped into the room, my reflection warping and twisting in the mirrors, and that's when I saw it. The chair was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it was turning toward me. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from me. My reflection in the mirrors was wrong. My face was pale, my eyes wide with terror, but there was something else there too. Something behind me, just out of sight. I spun around, but there was nothing there. When I turned back to the mirrors, the chair was facing me, and it wasn't empty anymore. The figure sitting in it was indistinct, a shadowy outline that seemed to shift and change as I stared at it. Its head was tilted to the side, as if it were studying me, and I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. The symbols on the floor began to glow brighter, their light casting strange, shifting patterns on the walls. The figure leaned forward, its form solidifying, and I realized with a jolt of horror that it wasn't a stranger. It was me. Or at least it looked like me. But its eyes were wrong, black and empty, like voids that sucked in the light. It smiled, a slow, cruel smile that made my stomach churn, and then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come back," it said, its voice a perfect mimicry of my own. The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I finally found the strength to move. I turned and ran, my feet slamming against the floor as I bolted down the hall. The hum was a roar now, a cacophony that threatened to split my skull. I didn't look back, didn't dare to. I just ran down the stairs, through the foyer, and out the door. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing on the sidewalk a block away from the house. I lay there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I finally looked up, the house was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and littered with debris. I stared at it, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But deep down, I knew. The house was still there. I could feel it like a weight pressing down on my chest. And I knew it wasn't done with me. Not yet. The house had always been there at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the town's streetlights. I'd passed it 1,000 times, always in daylight, always with the sun high enough to keep the shadows at bay. But tonight was different. Tonight, I had no choice but to walk by it in the dark. My car had broken down a mile back, and the nearest gas station was still a good 30 minutes away on foot. The woods loomed to my left, a wall of blackness that seemed to breathe, while the house stood to my right, its windows dark and lifeless, like empty eye sockets staring into the void. I told myself it was just an old house, abandoned for years, maybe decades. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged under the weight of time, and the yard was overgrown with weeds that reached up like skeletal hands. But as I walked closer, something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just the way the moonlight seemed to avoid it, casting it in a deeper shadow than the rest of the world. It was the silence. The woods were never silent. Even at night, there were always sounds: the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig. But here there was nothing. Just a heavy, oppressive quiet that pressed against my ears and made my skin crawl. I quickened my pace, my shoes crunching on the gravel shoulder of the road. The sound was too loud, too sharp, like it was drawing attention to me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. But the road was empty, the woods still and dark. When I turned back, I froze. The house was closer. I was sure of it. The distance between us had shrunk, as if it had taken a step forward while I wasn't looking. My heart thudded in my chest, and I told myself it was just my imagination, just the darkness playing tricks on me. But the unease in my gut grew heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I forced myself to keep walking, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. But the house seemed to pull at me like a magnet tugging at the iron in my blood. My gaze kept drifting back to it against my will. The windows were still dark, but now I thought I saw movement behind them, shadows shifting, flickering, like something was pacing just out of sight. My breath came faster, and I clenched my fists to stop my hands from shaking. It was just the wind, I told myself. Just the wind moving the curtains, if there were even curtains left in that place. But there was no wind. The air was perfectly still. I was almost past the house when I heard it, a sound so faint I almost missed it. A whisper, so soft it could have been my imagination, but it wasn't. It came from the house, from the open doorway that I hadn't noticed before. The door was ajar, just a crack, but it was enough to let the sound escape. It wasn't a word, not exactly. It was more like a sigh, a breathy exhale that carried with it a sense of longing, of hunger. My feet stopped moving as if they had a mind of their own. I stood there staring at the door, my pulse racing. The whisper came again, louder this time, and I realized it wasn't just one voice. It was many, layered over each other, a chorus of whispers that seemed to coil around me, pulling me closer. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but when I finally managed to break free of whatever hold the house had on me, I ran. I ran as fast as I could, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear. They filled my head, drowning out my thoughts, my fear, everything. I didn't stop until I reached the gas station, its fluorescent lights a harsh, blinding relief after the darkness of the road. I collapsed against the wall, gasping for air, my whole body trembling. The attendant inside gave me a strange look when I stumbled through the door, but I didn't care. I just needed to be around people, around light, around anything that wasn't that house. I bought a bottle of water and sat in the corner, trying to calm my racing heart. The whispers were gone now, but the memory of them lingered, like an echo in the back of my mind. I told myself it was over, that I was safe. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. The house was still out there waiting, and it wasn't done with me. I don't know why I went back. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something else, something darker, something I couldn't name. But the next night, I found myself standing in front of the house again, staring at that open door. The whispers were there, faint but unmistakable, calling to me. I told myself I wouldn't go in, that I would just look, just satisfy my curiosity and leave. But as I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight, I knew I was lying to myself. The house wanted me inside, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to resist. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and decay. The floorboards groaned with every step I took, and the walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows deepening as I moved further into the house. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I realized they were coming from upstairs. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the staircase. Each step felt like a mistake, like I was walking into a trap, but I couldn't stop. The whispers were inside my head now, guiding me, pulling me forward. The upstairs hallway was narrow, the walls lined with doors that hung open just enough to reveal the darkness within. The whispers were coming from the last door at the end of the hall. I could feel them now, not just in my ears but in my chest, in my bones. They were a part of me and I was a part of them. I reached for the door, my hand trembling, and pushed it open. The room was empty, except for a single mirror hanging on the far wall. It was old, the glass cracked and cloudy, but I could still see my reflection in it. Or at least I thought it was my reflection. The figure in the mirror looked like me, but there was something wrong with its eyes. They were too dark, too deep, like pits that went on forever. And then it smiled, a slow, cruel smile that sent a chill down my spine. The whispers stopped, and for a moment there was silence. And then the figure in the mirror reached out, its hand breaking through the glass, and grabbed me. I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up in my bed, the sun streaming through the windows, and told myself it had all been a dream. But the cuts on my arm, thin and precise, told a different story. And the whispers, they're still there in the back of my mind, waiting. I don't know what they want, but I know they're not done with me. And I know I'll have to go back to the house. The cuts on my arm were a constant reminder, thin and jagged like the edges of broken glass. They didn't hurt, not exactly, but they itched in a way that made my skin crawl, as if something beneath the surface was stirring, waiting to break free. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I'd somehow cut myself in my sleep, but deep down I knew better. The house had marked me. It had claimed me. And no matter how hard I tried to forget, the whispers in my mind wouldn't let me. They were always there, a low, insistent hum that grew louder whenever I closed my eyes, like a song I couldn't get out of my head. Days passed and I tried to go back to my normal life. I went to work, I ate meals, I pretended to sleep. But the house was always there, lurking at the edges of my thoughts, its dark windows and sagging porch haunting my dreams. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced I was back in that room, staring into the mirror, watching that thing that looked like me but wasn't, reach out and grab me. The cuts on my arm would throb, and the whispers would grow louder, more urgent, until I thought I'd go mad. I tried to resist. I really did. I told myself I'd never go back, that I'd stay away from the house no matter what. But the longer I stayed away, the worse it got. The whispers became screams, tearing through my mind like a hurricane, and the cuts on my arm began to spread, thin lines branching out like veins. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think. The house was calling me, and I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. It was a Thursday night when I finally gave in. I don't know why I chose that night, but something about the darkness felt different, heavier, like the air itself was alive and watching. I drove to the edge of town, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The road was empty, the woods a wall of blackness on either side. When I reached the house, I parked my car on the shoulder and sat there for a long time, staring at the sagging porch and the open door. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and I knew there was no turning back. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under my feet, and walked toward the house. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the silence was so complete it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. The door was still ajar, just as I'd left it, and the darkness inside seemed to pulse, like a living thing. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I stepped inside. The house was different this time. The air was colder, the shadows deeper, and the sense of wrongness was so strong it made my stomach churn. The floorboards creaked under my feet, the sound echoing through the empty rooms like a scream. The whispers were everywhere now, filling the air, filling my head, and I realized they weren't just voices. They were memories, fragments of lives that had been swallowed by the house, their stories twisted and broken until all that was left was this endless, hungry noise. I moved through the house like a sleepwalker, my feet carrying me toward the staircase. The walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows pressing against my skin, and I could feel the house breathing, its pulse slow and steady, like the heartbeat of some great, slumbering beast. The stairs groaned under my weight, each step a struggle, as if the house itself was trying to hold me back. But I couldn't stop. The whispers were guiding me, pulling me forward, and I knew I had to reach the room at the end of the hall. The door was still open, the mirror still hanging on the wall. The glass was cracked, the surface cloudy, but I could see my reflection staring back at me. Or at least I thought it was my reflection. The figure in the mirror looked like me, but its eyes were wrong, too dark, too deep, and its smile was too wide, too sharp. It reached out, its hand breaking through the glass, and I felt a cold, bony grip wrap around my wrist. The world spun, and suddenly I was somewhere else. The room was gone, the house was gone, and I was standing in a place that shouldn't exist. The ground beneath my feet was black and slick like oil, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The sky, if it could even be called a sky, was a swirling mass of darkness, shot through with streaks of red and purple that pulsed like veins. The whispers were louder here, more coherent, and I realized they were telling me a story about the house and the things that lived inside it. They told me about the first people who had lived here, a family who had built the house with their own hands, only to be consumed by the darkness that had always been there, waiting. They told me about the others who had come after, drawn to the house by some unseen force, only to be swallowed whole. And they told me about the mirror, the gateway to this place, where the house kept its secrets and its prisoners. I tried to pull away, to break free of the thing that held me, but its grip was like iron. The figure in the mirror, the thing that looked like me but wasn't, smiled that cruel, sharp smile and pulled me closer. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they weren't just telling me a story. It started with a noise. A soft, persistent tapping against my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a branch knocking against the glass in the middle of the night. But as the tapping continued, in steady intervals, I felt something cold creep into my spine. It wasn't random like the wind. It had a rhythm, a deliberate pattern. I turned over in bed, listening. My room was dark, but the pale light of the moon streamed in through the curtains, casting a dim glow over the furniture. The tapping stopped. I held my breath, waiting for it to start again, but there was only silence now. I sighed, shaking my head at my own paranoia. It was probably just my imagination. I pulled the blankets up to my chin, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling coiling in my stomach. Sleep came slowly, restless, and filled with strange, shadowy dreams. The next morning, I almost forgot about the tapping. Almost. As I was getting ready, I glanced toward the window and noticed something that sent a shiver through my body. There were faint smudges on the glass. Not like condensation, not like fingerprints. These marks were different, long, thin streaks that started near the top of the window and dragged downward. My fingers trembled as I touched them. They were on the outside. I stepped back, my mind racing through explanations. Maybe a bird, maybe something fell from the tree nearby. I tried to brush it off, but something about it lingered in my thoughts all day. That night, I went to bed with a strange sense of anticipation, as if I were waiting for something. Hours passed and nothing happened. Just when I began to drift off, the tapping returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. My heart pounded as I turned my head toward the window, afraid of what I might see. The room was dim, the outside world shrouded in darkness. But I knew something was there. The tapping stopped. I held my breath, ears straining for any other sounds. And then, softly, barely a whisper, a scraping noise, like nails dragging down the glass. My body tensed. I wanted to get up, turn on the light, reassure myself that nothing was there, but fear held me frozen. The sound continued for what felt like an eternity. And then, silence. I barely slept. The next morning, I rushed to the window as soon as the sun was up. More streaks, longer this time, and lower, as if whatever had made them was reaching further down. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a raccoon or something else. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I decided not to sleep with the window uncovered that night. I pulled the thick curtains across, blocking out any view of the outside. As darkness fell, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting. The room was quiet, too quiet. My heart pounded in anticipation. Hours passed, and then a sound. Not the tapping this time. Something softer. Breathing. It was faint but unmistakable. A slow, deliberate inhale and exhale just beyond the window. I clenched the blanket in my fists, forcing myself not to move. The breathing continued, steady, patient. It was waiting for something. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing it away. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Then suddenly a sharp, quick knock. Just once. And then silence. The air was thick with tension, but nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I hesitated before pulling back the curtains. I didn't want to see, but I had to. The window was covered in streaks now. Long, jagged lines, smeared as if something had pressed against the glass. And in the center of the window, there was a mark that made my blood run cold. A handprint. Not large, not monstrous. Human-sized. But distorted, the fingers elongated as if they had been stretched. I stumbled back, my mind spinning. This wasn't normal. This wasn't something I could explain away. I avoided my room that evening. I stayed in the living room, lights on, trying to distract myself. But as the night deepened, an oppressive feeling settled over me, as if something was waiting for me. Dreading what I might find, I finally forced myself back to my bedroom. I hesitated at the door, my fingers tightening around the handle. Slowly I pushed it open. The room was quiet, unchanged. I let out a shaky breath, relieved. And then I saw it. The curtains. They were open. Wide open. I had closed them. I was certain of it. My hands went numb as I stared at the window. The streaks were still there. The handprints still visible. And for the first time, I noticed something outside. A figure. Standing just beyond the glass. Motionless. Watching. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't blink. The figure was barely visible in the darkness, but I could make out its shape. Thin, too tall, its limbs slightly off as if its proportions weren't quite right. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was paralyzed. Then, slowly, the figure raised a hand. It placed it against the glass, aligning perfectly with the distorted handprint. My stomach twisted with dread. Then it moved. Not away. Not toward me. It tilted its head just slightly as if studying me. I stumbled backward, finally breaking free from my frozen state. My hands scrambled for the light switch, and the moment the bulb flickered on, the figure was gone. The window was empty. The night outside was silent. But the fear remained, lodged deep in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I did something I should have done earlier. I checked the outside of my house. I expected to find footprints in the dirt beneath the window. Some sign that a person had been there. But there was nothing. No footprints. No disturbances. As if whatever had been watching me had left no trace at all. That night I stayed awake waiting, but the tapping never came. No breathing. No handprints. Just silence. Days passed. I began to convince myself that it was over, that maybe it had been some strange dream or a trick of my mind. But deep down I knew better. I could still feel it. The presence. Watching. Waiting. And then, a week later, just as I was beginning to relax, I heard it again. Not from the window this time. From inside the house. It started as a whisper. A faint rustling sound in the darkness, so quiet I thought I had imagined it. But then it grew louder, soft shuffling footsteps across the wooden floor. My breath hitched. My body turned rigid beneath the blankets. The sound was inside the house. No mistaking it now. Someone, or something, was moving. I didn't dare move. My mind screamed at me to get up, to run, but my body refused to cooperate. Every muscle locked in place, heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They weren't coming from the window. They were inside the hallway. Closer. The air around me grew thick, suffocating. I strained to hear over the pounding in my ears. The sound stopped just outside my bedroom door. Silence stretched through the room, taut and heavy. I could feel something there, just beyond the door, standing motionless. Waiting. My fingers gripped the sheets, the fabric damp with sweat. My mind raced through possibilities. A break-in? No, this was different. There had been no forced entry, no sign of an intruder. The door had been locked. Whatever was outside wasn't human. Then the knob rattled. A sharp, metallic jingle as if someone were testing it. My breath hitched. The door didn't open, but the rattling continued, steady, patient. I clenched my teeth to keep from gasping. The sound stopped abruptly. The silence was worse. I imagined it standing there, listening, waiting for me to react. I squeezed my eyes shut. Maybe if I didn't move, it would leave. A long, slow creak echoed through the room. My blood turned to ice. The door was opening. My stomach dropped as I realized the lock, somehow impossibly, had failed. A sliver of darkness spread across the floor, inching closer as the door swung wider. I sucked in a sharp breath, my body tensing, heart racing so fast I thought it would explode. I didn't look. I couldn't. But I felt it. Something standing in the doorway, watching me. The air grew colder, an unnatural chill that seeped into my bones. The weight of its presence pressed down on my chest. A whisper of movement. The floor creaked. It was stepping inside. My fingers twitched. I had to do something, anything. My hand shot toward the lamp on my nightstand. The moment my fingers found the switch, I flicked it on. A warm glow flooded the room. My breath came in ragged gasps. Nothing. The door was wide open, but the space beyond it was empty. No figure. No shadow. Just the gaping blackness of the hallway stretching into the unknown. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move. My limbs felt numb as I swung them over the side of the bed, feet touching the cold floor. I walked toward the door, every step slow, measured. The air in the hallway was still, suffocating. I reached for the knob, my fingers brushing against the metal. It was ice cold. I shut the door, locked it. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I scoured the house, searching for any sign of an intruder. I checked the locks. All were intact. No windows broken, no doors forced open. I tried to tell myself it had been a dream. Sleep paralysis, stress, anything to rationalize what had happened. But deep down, I knew better. Days passed. I didn't hear the tapping anymore. No more whispering footsteps, no more rattling doorknobs. I wanted to believe it was over, but the feeling never left. The sensation of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my vision, followed me everywhere. One evening, as I was brushing my teeth, I glanced up at the mirror and froze. The reflection was wrong. At first, I couldn't pinpoint why, but then I noticed it. My reflection wasn't moving in sync with me. My hand had paused, but in the mirror, my reflection still brushed its teeth. My chest constricted. I blinked, and in that brief moment, it stopped. It met my gaze, staring at me through the glass with dark, unblinking eyes. I stumbled back, knocking over a bottle of mouthwash. My reflection remained still, watching. A sickening sense of dread twisted in my stomach. I forced myself to look away, heart hammering. When I looked back, my reflection was normal again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That night, I slept with the lights on. The next morning, I left the house. I needed air, space, a break from the suffocating fear. I walked through the neighborhood trying to clear my mind. But as I passed a parked car, something caught my eye in the reflection of its window. A figure, standing in the middle of the street, facing me. I spun around. The street was empty. My breath came in shallow gasps. Slowly, I turned back to the car window. The reflection was still there, still watching. I took a step closer, my pulse roaring in my ears. The figure had no face, just a void where features should be. My stomach lurched, and then it moved. Not in the reflection, outside of it. A flicker of motion in my peripheral vision. I turned just in time to see a shadow slip between two houses, vanishing into the darkness. I stood frozen, my legs trembling beneath me. I ran home. That night, I did something I should have done long ago. I packed a bag. I was leaving. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to follow me. It couldn't. I told myself that over and over again as I stuffed clothes into my suitcase. But the moment I reached for my keys, the room grew cold. The overhead light flickered, then dimmed. The air around me thickened, pressing against my skin. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, standing in the doorway. Not outside, inside. It was no longer just a shadow. It was real, tangible, and it was inside my home. My vision blurred as panic seized my body. I forced myself to move, to run, but the thing in the doorway took a step forward. My breath caught in my throat. The closer it got, the heavier the air became, pressing down on me like a weight. The light flickered violently now, plunging the room into brief moments of complete darkness. And each time the light returned, the figure was closer. I reached for my phone. My fingers fumbled as I tried to dial, but the screen was blank. Dead. The power in the house failed all at once, leaving me in utter darkness. My heartbeat pounded against my skull. I could hear it breathing now, just inches away. Slow. I squeezed my eyes shut. This isn't real. This isn't real. Then, in the silence, a voice. Oh, ragged. You let me in. My stomach dropped. My body locked in place. The realization hit me like ice-cold water. It had never been outside. Not really. It had always been here. Waiting. Watching. And now it was with me. Forever. Story 2. The town was quiet, too quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if the entire world was holding its breath. I had only returned to my childhood home because of my father's passing, but the longer I stayed, the more I felt something was wrong. The streets were empty, the neighbors barely acknowledged me, and at night, a strange hum filled the air.